Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. A Candle in the Cabin Window by Emma Ashwood, Chapter 1. The snow fell thick over the New York docks that Christmas Eve morning in 1871. Joseph Mallory stamped his boots against the wooden planks, trying to keep his feet warm as he hauled another crate toward the warehouse. His breath came out in white puffs, and his fingers ached even through his work gloves. "Keep moving, boys," his father called from near the crane. Thomas Mallory was a big man, shoulders broad from 20 years of dock work. Even in the bitter cold, he had a smile on his weathered face. "Just a few more loads and we'll be done for the day. Home by supper, I promise." Joe's younger brother Danny laughed as he hefted a smaller box. At 17, he was still growing into his frame, all arms and legs. "Ma's making that beef stew tonight, Pa, the one with the carrots." "Your ma's been gone 3 years now, son," Thomas said gently. His voice carried that familiar sadness it always did when he spoke of her. "But I remember that recipe. We'll make it ourselves tonight, just the three of us." Joe nodded but said nothing. He missed his mother every day, but especially at Christmas. She had made their small tenement feel warm no matter how cold it got outside. Now it was just him, Pa, and Danny trying to keep the place running. The docks were busy despite the weather. Ships lined the waterfront, and men swarmed over them like ants, unloading cargo that needed to reach the stores before Christmas Day. The air smelled of salt water, tar, and the pine wood stacked high near the warehouses. Somewhere in the distance, someone was humming, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." "You boys are good workers," Thomas said as they paused to catch their breath. Pride filled his voice. "Steady jobs, honest pay, your ma would be proud." Joe met his father's eyes and saw the hope there. Thomas wanted to believe they'd made it through the worst times, that they were climbing towards something better. "We're lucky to have work, Pa," Joe said. It was true. Plenty of men stood idle on street corners, desperate for any job at all. A whistle blew. The foreman waved his arms, directing the crane operator to lift another load of timber. The massive wooden beams swung slowly through the falling snow, suspended by thick cables that groaned under the weight. Joe watched the load rise. Something about it didn't look right. The timber was stacked unevenly, and the cables seemed to strain more than usual. "Pa," he started to say, but Thomas had already turned back to the warehouse, Danny beside him. They stood directly in the path of the swinging load. Joe opened his mouth to shout a warning. The cable snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Time seemed to slow. The timber fell, spinning as it dropped. Men scattered, yelling. Joe lunged forward, his arm outstretched, knowing even as he moved that he was too far away. The wood crashed down with a terrible thud. Snow exploded into the air, mixing with splinters and dust. When it settled, Joe saw his father's hand, still and pale, extending from beneath the massive pile of timber. A few feet away, Danny's cap lay in the snow, crushed and torn. Joe's legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the snow, unable to look away from his father's hand. Someone was screaming. It took him a moment to realize the sound was coming from his own throat. Men rushed forward. They shouted orders, trying to lift the timber. But Joe could see it was too late. No one could survive being crushed like that. Not his father, not Danny. The foreman appeared, his face pale. He grabbed Joe's shoulder. "Back up, Mallory. Let the men work." Joe shook him off. He staggered to his feet and tried to reach the pile, but strong hands pulled him away. He fought them at first, then went limp. What was the point? They were gone, just like Ma. Everyone he loved was gone. The owner of the shipping company arrived an hour later, stepping carefully through the snow in his fine leather boots. Mr. Pemberton was a portly man with a thick mustache and a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. He surveyed the scene with cold eyes. "Regrettable," he said. His breath smelled of cigars and brandy. "Most regrettable. But these accidents happen. The men know the risks." Joe stared at him. "Risks? That cable was worn through. I saw it fraying last week. I told the foreman." Pemberton's expression didn't change. The company cannot be held responsible for every mechanical failure. We'll provide a modest payment for burial costs. That should be sufficient." "Sufficient?" Joe's voice rose. "My father and brother are dead, and I'm very sorry for your loss." Pemberton pulled out a pocket watch and checked the time. "However, this incident has slowed our operations considerably. We have cargo that must reach the stores by tomorrow. I'm afraid we'll have to let you go, Mallory. We need men who can focus on their work, not stand around grieving." The words hit Joe like a physical blow. "You're firing me? Today? It's business, nothing personal. Come by the office on Christmas Eve to collect whatever wages you're owed." Pemberton turned and walked away without another word. Joe stood alone in the falling snow. Around him, the other workers had returned to their tasks. They avoided making eye contact. No one wanted to be associated with bad luck. No one wanted to be the next one fired. He looked at the pile of timber. Men had finally managed to move enough of it to pull out the bodies. They laid his father and brother side by side on the dock, covering them with canvas tarps. Snow was already beginning to gather on the fabric. Joe walked over and knelt beside them. He couldn't bring himself to lift the tarps and look at their faces. Better to remember them as they were this morning, smiling and talking about supper. "I don't know what to do, Pa," he whispered. "You always knew what to do, but I don't. I don't know how to fix this." The snow kept falling. The hymn someone had been humming earlier had stopped. Christmas Eve tomorrow, and Joe would be spending it burying his family. He stood slowly and walked away from the docks. His whole body felt numb and not from the cold. He walked for hours through the snowy streets, not knowing where he was going or why. When darkness fell, he found himself back at the tenement he'd shared with his father and brother. The rooms were cold and empty. No fire in the stove, no smell of cooking, just silence and shadows. Joe sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. What was he supposed to do now? He had no job, no family. The rent was due next week, and he didn't have the money to pay it. Even if he found another job immediately, it wouldn't be enough. He'd end up on the street, begging like so many others. Rage rose in him, hot and sudden. This wasn't fair. His father had worked himself to the bone for that company. Danny had barely lived long enough to grow a proper beard, and Pemberton had called their deaths regrettable, like he was talking about spoiled milk. The company owed them, owed Joe in some way for what they'd taken. The next day, Christmas Eve, Joe walked to the shipping company office. The streets were busy with last-minute shoppers, families hurrying home with packages and smiles. Joe moved through them like a ghost, without seeing. The office was quiet when he arrived. Most of the workers had already left for the holiday. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up when Joe gave his name. "Mallory? Right. Wait here." Joe stood in the empty hallway, listening to the ticking of a clock on the wall. Through an open door, he could see into Pemberton's private office. The man himself was gone, probably home with his family, enjoying Christmas Eve dinner by a warm fire. The safe stood against the far wall. Its door hung open. Joe stared at it. He could see stacks of bills inside the company's cash reserves. Money that should have gone to better equipment. Money that should have saved lives instead of lining Pemberton's pockets. The clerk's voice drifted from another room. He was talking to someone, laughing about holiday plans. Joe's feet carried him forward before his brain caught up. He crossed into Pemberton's office, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. His hands reached into the safe, grabbing bills and shoving them into his coat. He didn't count. He didn't think. He just took and took until his pockets bulged. Then he walked out, down the hallway, through the front door, into the snow. No one stopped him. No one even looked at him. He was 3 blocks away when he finally paused in an alley and counted what he'd taken. $2,300. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. Enough to start over somewhere. Enough to disappear. Guilt crashed over him like a wave. What had he done? He wasn't a thief. His father had raised him better than this. But his father was dead, crushed under timber that should never have fallen, and Pemberton would never face justice for that. Joe Mallory? He spun around. Maggie Jones stood at the mouth of the alley, a market basket on her arm. She lived 2 doors down from his tenement, a kind woman who'd brought soup after his mother died. Her eyes went to his coat, where the bulk of the money made strange lumps. Then she saw his sleeve. He followed her gaze and noticed for the first time that it was stained with blood. He must have cut his hand somehow without realizing it when he was removing the cash from the safe. "Joe, what happened? Are you hurt?" "Going west, Maggie." The words came out hoarse. "Ain't nothing left for me here." "West? But Joe, your father and brother, the funeral?" "Already buried them this morning. Simple graves, best I could afford." That much was true, at least. He'd used his last wages to pay for a plot in the pauper cemetery. Maggie's face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, Joe, I'm so sorry, but running away won't help. You have friends here, people who care." "I appreciate that, Maggie. I do, but I can't stay. Too many memories. Too much." He couldn't finish. Too much guilt, too much shame. She reached out as if to touch his arm, then pulled back. "If you must go, then go with God, Joe Mallory. I'll pray for you." "Thank you," he managed to say. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the snow. As darkness fell, carolers gathered on the street corners. Their voices rose in the cold air, singing, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." The same hymn someone had been humming on the docks yesterday morning, back when his father and brother were still alive. Joe pulled his coat tight around the stolen money and vanished into the falling snow. Behind him, the carolers sang about comfort and joy. Ahead of him lay only guilt and an uncertain road westward. By morning, he would be gone. Joseph Mallory would cease to exist, buried under snow and lies. Someone else would have to carry his sins forward into whatever future the stolen money could buy. The candles in the tenement windows glowed warm and golden as he passed. Families gathering for Christmas Eve. Joe walked faster, not looking back, carrying $2,300 and a weight in his chest that no amount of money could ever lift. Chapter 2. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. Maggie Jones woke to church bells ringing across the dock quarter. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to their joyful sound, then remembered the encounter in the alley yesterday. Joe Mallory, heading west, blood on his sleeve, that strange look in his eyes, like a man who'd seen something terrible and couldn't unsee it. She rose and dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on her wool dress. The look on Joe's face yesterday haunted her. He'd lost his father and brother just the day before. Of course he was in shock. Of course he wanted to leave. Who could blame him? She made herself a simple breakfast and was just sitting down to eat when someone knocked hard on her door. 2 policemen stood on her step, their breath steaming in the cold air. "Mrs. Jones?" the taller one asked. "We need to speak with you about Joseph Mallory." Her heart jumped. "Joe? What about him?" "May we come in?" Maggie stepped back, letting them into her small parlor. They removed their hats but remained standing, making her feel even smaller than usual. "When did you last see Mallory?" the tall officer asked. "Yesterday, in the afternoon. Why? What's happened?" The 2 men exchanged glances. "There was a robbery at the Pemberton Shipping Company office, Christmas Eve. Someone took over $2,000 from the safe." Maggie's stomach dropped. $2,000. The blood on Joe's sleeve, his wild eyes. No, not Joe. He wouldn't. "Mallory was due to collect his wages that day," the shorter officer continued. "He was seen entering the building. The clerk stepped away for a few minutes, and when he returned, Mallory was gone. So was the money." "You think Joe stole it?" Maggie heard the shake in her own voice. "We're trying to locate him." "You said you saw him yesterday?" Maggie's mind raced. If she told them about the alley, about him saying he was going west, they'd hunt him down. They'd throw him in prison. A boy who just buried his father and brother. But if she lied, she'd be protecting a thief. Her faith told her the truth was always right, but her heart said Joe had suffered enough. "I saw him a few days ago," she heard herself say. "Before the accident, he was heading to work. That's the last time we spoke." The lie felt heavy on her tongue. The tall officer wrote something in a small notebook. "If he contacts you or you hear anything about his whereabouts, you need to inform us immediately." "Of course, officer." After they left, Maggie sank into her chair and stared at the wall. What had she done? She'd lied to the police. She'd helped a thief escape justice. Or had she helped a grieving boy escape false accusations? She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She spent Sunday alone, unable to face going to church. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Joe's face in the alley, that desperate, haunted look. By evening, guilt sat like a stone in her chest. She lit a candle and placed it in her window, the way her mother used to do when Maggie's father was out late. "Lord," she whispered, "watch over Joe Mallory. Whatever he's done, wherever he's gone, keep him safe. And forgive me for lying. I don't know if I did right or wrong, but I pray you understand." The candle flame flickered but held steady. Over the following weeks, gossip about the robbery spread through the dock quarter like wildfire. Some said Joe Mallory was a cold-blooded thief who'd planned the whole situation. Others insisted he was innocent, framed by the company to avoid paying out death benefits. Maggie kept her silence, but every time someone mentioned Joe's name, she felt that stone in her chest grow heavier. The first Christmas after Joe disappeared, Maggie lit her candle again. She sat by her window and prayed for his soul, wherever he was. She told herself he'd fled in grief, not greed, that he was a good boy driven to desperation by circumstances beyond his control. She needed to believe that. The second Christmas, she did the same. Lit the candle, whispered her prayers, asked God to have mercy on Joe Mallory. The third Christmas, the fourth, the fifth. Every year, the ritual remained the same. Her Christmas candle burning in the window, a silent prayer for a boy who'd vanished into the snow 7 years ago. During those years, Maggie's own life changed. Her work as a housekeeper ended when the family she served moved to Boston. She found new employment as a laundress, taking in washing from various businesses in the area. One of her regular clients was Caldwell & Briggs Detective Agency, a small operation that handled everything from missing persons to debt collection. Maggie picked up their laundry every Monday and returned it pressed and folded every Friday. She'd been working for them for nearly 2 years when it happened. It was a cold Tuesday in December. Maggie arrived at the agency office to drop off an emergency load of shirts. The front room was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the back office. The door stood slightly open. She shouldn't have listened. She knew better. But the nature of the conversation caught her attention. The Mallory case. A man's voice, low and gravelly. 7 years cold. Why are we looking at it again? Because Pemberton's widow is still offering a reward. That was Mr. Briggs himself, the agency owner. $500 for information leading to Joseph Mallory's arrest. Maggie froze, the bundle of shirts clutched to her chest. "Man's probably dead by now," the first voice said, "or changed his name and started over somewhere out west." "Maybe, but the widow wants closure, and $500 is $500. I'm assigning it to you, Nate. You're good at finding men who don't want to be found." Maggie heard papers rustling. "Not much to go on," the man called Nate said. "Description's vague. Young, dark-haired, dock worker build. Could be 1,000 men." "Keep reading." A pause. "Says here he had a scar on his temple from a fight a few years back, and his left arm didn't straighten all the way. Old break that didn't heal right." Maggie's breath caught. She remembered Joe's crooked arm. She'd seen it 100 times when he carried boxes past her window, and the scar, a thin white line above his right eye. "Still not much," Nate said, "but I'll start asking around the docks. See if anyone remembers him having family or friends who might know where he went." "Good. Report back to me next week." Maggie's hands trembled so badly that she nearly dropped the shirts. She set them quietly on the front desk and fled before anyone could see her. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Joe, about the candle she lit for him every Christmas, about the lie she'd told 7 years ago to protect him, and now a bounty hunter was looking for him. Days passed. Maggie tried to push the conversation from her mind, but guilt gnawed at her like a hungry rat. Whenever she delivered laundry to the agency, she wondered if Nate Briggs had found any new information. Every time she walked past the church, she thought about confession and redemption and the weight of secrets. 2 weeks later, she arrived at the agency to pick up the next load of washing. Mr. Briggs was out, but Nate Briggs sat at the desk in the front room studying a file. He looked up when she entered. He was lean and weathered, with gray at his temples and eyes that seemed to look right through a person. "You're the laundress," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Maggie Jones." He studied her for a long moment. "You've worked here a while?" "2 years, sir." "You live in the dock quarter?" Her heart began to pound. "Yes, sir, near the waterfront." Nate Briggs leaned back in his chair. "Then maybe you can help me. I'm looking for information about a man named Joseph Mallory, disappeared 7 years ago, Christmas Eve, 1871. Would have been about 23 years old then." Maggie's mouth went dry. She could lie again. She could shake her head and say she'd never heard the name. But 7 years of lighting candles and whispering prayers had worn her down. 7 years of guilt had carved hollows in her soul. "I knew him," she heard herself say. "Not well, but I knew him." Nate Briggs sat forward, suddenly alert. "You knew Joseph Mallory?" "He lived 2 doors down from me, with his father and brother." The words tumbled out now, unstoppable. "I saw him most days. His mother had passed a few years before. Then his father and brother were killed in that terrible accident at the docks." "When did you last see him?" This was it, the moment she'd been dreading for 7 years. "Christmas Eve," Maggie whispered. 1871, the day he disappeared. I bumped into him in an alley. He told me he was going west, said there was nothing left for him here." Nate pulled out a notebook and began writing. "Did he say where west?" "No, just west. He seemed," she paused, remembering. "Desperate, broken. He just lost his whole family. Did you notice anything else about him? Anything unusual?" Maggie closed her eyes. His sleeve, there was blood on his sleeve. Nate's pencil stopped moving. "Blood?" "Yes. I asked if he was hurt, but he didn't answer. He just said goodbye and walked away. That was the last I ever saw of Joe Mallory." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Mrs. Jones," Nate said slowly, "did you tell this to the police back in 1871? Shame burned through her. "No, I lied to them. Said I'd seen him days before, not that same day. I thought I was protecting him. He'd just buried his father and brother. I couldn't believe he'd stolen anything. I thought maybe he was innocent and just running from grief. And now? Now I don't know what I think." Tears pricked her eyes. "But I can't carry the guilt anymore. If Joe did steal that money, it's wrong that I helped him escape. And if he didn't, then the truth needs to come out either way." Nate stood and walked to the window. He stared out at the gray December sky for a long time before speaking again. "You said his left arm didn't straighten right?" "That's correct. Old injury from when he was younger." "And the scar on his temple?" "Above his right eye, from a fight at the docks a few years before the accident." Nate turned and looked at her. "Mrs. Jones, you've just given me the first real lead in this case. Those details match the description we have on file. If I can find a man out west matching that description, there's a good chance it's Joseph Mallory." Maggie sank into a chair. "What will happen to him?" "He'll be arrested and brought back to stand trial for theft." "Even after all these years?" "Yes, ma'am, the law doesn't have a time limit on theft of that magnitude." Maggie pressed her hands to her face. "Oh, Lord, what have I done?" Nate's voice softened slightly. "You've told the truth, Mrs. Jones. That's all any of us can do." After Maggie left the agency, she walked home in a daze. The December wind cut through her coat, but she barely felt it. She'd done it. After 7 years of silence, she'd spoken up. She'd given that bounty hunter exactly what he needed to find Joe. And now Joe would face justice or vengeance. She no longer knew which. That night, as darkness fell over the dock quarter, Maggie lit her Christmas candle earlier than usual. She placed it in the window and knelt beside it. "Forgive me, Joe," she whispered to the flame. "I thought I was doing right. 7 years ago, I thought I was protecting you. Tonight, I thought I was telling the truth. But maybe I've just condemned you instead." The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. "Lord," she continued, her voice breaking, "I don't know if what I did was right or wrong anymore. But Joe Mallory is in your hands now. Whatever happens to him, I pray you show him mercy. And I pray you forgive me for whatever part I've played in all this." She stayed there until the candle burned low, praying for a man who'd vanished into the snow 7 years ago, carrying guilt and stolen money. A man who, thanks to her words today, might soon be found. Chapter 3. Joseph Carter rode the fence line at dawn, his breath steaming in the cold Colorado air. 7 years had passed since he'd left New York, and in that time, he'd built himself a new life from the ground up. Or rather, built it from stolen money buried deep in guilt. The sun was just breaking over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. His cattle grazed peacefully in the valley below, their dark shapes moving slowly through the frosted grass. He counted them without thinking, the way he'd done every morning for years. 43 head. Not a massive herd, but solid, honest. Except it wasn't honest at all. Joe touched the scar above his right eye, a habit he'd never broken. The mark from that dock fight felt like a brand sometimes, marking him for what he was. A thief, a coward, a man who'd run instead of facing what he'd done. His horse, a sturdy roan named Ezra, snorted and tossed his head. Joe patted the animal's neck absently. Even the horse had been bought with dirty money. All that he owned, all that he'd built, traced back to that Christmas Eve 7 years ago when he'd shoved bills into his coat pockets with shaking hands. $2,300. The number haunted him. He'd used it carefully, stretching every cent, bought this land cheap from a widow heading back east, built the cabin himself, one log at a time, started with just 6 head of cattle and bred them up over the years. Worked harder than any man in the territory, trying to convince himself that sweat could wash away sin. It couldn't. Joe finished his ride and headed back toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney of the bunkhouse in which his hired men were waking up. 3 of them. All outcasts in their own way, men nobody else would take a chance on. There was old Pete, who'd served time for horse theft but swore he'd been framed. Joe believed him. Maybe because he needed to believe that innocent men sometimes got blamed for crimes. Maybe because it made him feel better about his own guilt. Then there was Miguel, a Mexican cowhand who drifted north after some trouble in Texas. He never talked about it, and Joe never asked. A man was entitled to his secrets. And young Tommy, barely 18, who'd run away from a cruel stepfather back in Kansas. The boy had shown up half-starved last spring, and Joe had given him work and a place to sleep. The gratitude in Tommy's eyes had been almost painful to see. Joe dismounted and walked Ezra to the barn. Miguel was already there, forking hay into the stalls. "Morning, boss," Miguel said, touching his hat brim. "Morning. How are the horses?" "Good. That mare might foal early, though. I'll keep watch." Joe nodded. "Appreciate it. Stack, you men get breakfast yet? Pete's cooking. Says it'll be ready soon." "Tell him I'll pay fair wages this week. Christmas is coming, and you all earned a bonus." Miguel's weathered face broke into a smile. "You're a good man, Mr. Carter." The words hit Joe like a punch. A good man, if only Miguel knew. "Just trying to do right," Joe muttered, turning away before the guilt showed on his face. He walked toward the cabin, his left arm aching the way it always did in cold weather. The old break that had never healed quite straight. Another mark of his past, like the scar on his temple. Physical reminders of Joseph Mallory, the man he used to be. Inside the cabin, he stoked the fire and made coffee. The place was simple but solid. One room with a bed, a table, and a stove. Shelves held his few books, including the Bible his mother had given him before she died. He couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it. What right did he have to read scripture when his whole life was built on theft? After breakfast, Joe hitched up the wagon. Today he had business in town, the kind that made him feel slightly less like a fraud. The ride to Three Pines took an hour. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a church, a saloon, and a handful of other buildings, and 3 very old, very large pine trees. Joe knew most folks by name, and they knew him as Joseph Carter, honest rancher. He pulled up behind the church and found Reverend Walsh sweeping the front steps. "Joe," the Reverend called, waving. He was a young man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a ready smile. "Good to see you." "Reverend, I brought that beef I promised for the Christmas larder." "Bless you, son. The families will be grateful." Reverend Walsh came down the steps and looked at the quarter of beef wrapped in canvas in the wagon bed. "This is generous. Just trying to help where I can." The Reverend studied him with those knowing eyes. "You do a lot of that, Joe, helping. Some might say you're trying to earn your way to heaven." Joe's heart skipped. Did the Reverend suspect something? "Just seems like the right thing to do," Joe said carefully. "It is, but remember, grace isn't earned. It's given freely to those who ask." Joe nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If only it were that simple. After unloading the beef, Joe drove to the schoolhouse at the edge of town. The building was small, just one room, but it served the families scattered across the territory. Miss Sarah Thompson taught there, a spinster lady from Boston who'd come west for adventure and stayed to educate frontier children. Joe found her outside, examining the sagging front porch with a worried expression. "Mr. Carter," she said, relief flooding her face. "Thank goodness. I was just wondering how we'd fix this before it collapses. That's why I'm here. Brought lumber and nails. Should have it repaired by sundown. I can't pay you much. Don't want payment. Just doing my part." Miss Thompson's eyes got misty. "You're a good man, Joe Carter. This town is lucky to have you." There it was again. Good man. The words cut deeper each time he heard them. Joe spent the afternoon rebuilding the porch. The work felt good, honest labor that left his muscles aching and his hands scraped raw. For a few hours, he could almost forget what he really was. By the time he finished, the sun was setting and his shadow stretched long across the schoolyard. He loaded his tools back in the wagon and headed home, waving to folks as he passed. They all smiled and called greetings. Joe Carter, the helpful neighbor, the generous rancher, the good Christian man, all lies. Back at the cabin after dark, Joe lit a lantern and sat at his small table. He pulled out his ledger, the one where he tracked every penny that came in and went out. The pages were neat, organized, showing a modest but steady profit over the years. Cattle sales, $400. Hay sales, $60. Horse trade, $120. All legitimate income. All earned through hard work. But it didn't matter, because under the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth, sat the original $2,300. He'd replaced every cent of it that he had spent so that every purchase, every investment, had come from money he'd earned honestly since arriving in Colorado. But that didn't change the fact that the stolen money had given him his start. Without it, he'd never have been able to buy this land. The whole ranch was built on that foundation of sin, and no amount of honest work could change it. Joe closed the ledger and stared at the cabin wall. Christmas was only a few weeks away, 7 years since he'd fled New York. 7 years of trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness. It wasn't working. He knelt beside his bed as he did every night and tried to pray. The words came slowly, awkwardly, like they always did. "Lord," he whispered, "tell me how to make this right before another Christmas passes. I've tried to do good. I've helped folks where I could. I've worked hard and paid fair wages, but it's not enough. I know it's not enough." He paused, listening to the silence. "I stole that money. I ran like a coward, and every good deed I've done since feels like I'm just trying to buy my way out of hell. But you can't buy forgiveness, can you? So what do I do? How do I fix what I broke?" No answer came. It never did. Joe stood slowly, his knees creaking. He was 30 years old and felt twice that age, worn down by guilt and secrets. He walked to his small desk and pulled out a piece of paper. For weeks now, an idea had been growing in his mind. Maybe a crazy idea, maybe a desperate one. But he had to do something. His hand shook slightly as he dipped the pen in ink and began to write. "Rancher seeks kind-hearted woman for companionship and shared faith. Must be honest and hardworking. Will provide comfortable home and respect. Write to Joseph Carter, 3 Pines, Colorado." He read it over 3 times, making small changes. The words felt inadequate, but what else could he say? He couldn't tell the truth in a matrimonial advertisement. Couldn't write, "Thief seeks woman to share his guilt-soaked life." Maybe a wife would make the cabin feel less empty. Maybe having someone to care for would give his life purpose beyond just trying to earn redemption he didn't deserve. Or maybe he was just selfish, wanting companionship while hiding who he really was. Joe folded the paper and set it aside. Tomorrow he'd ride to town and post it to the Matrimonial Times. Then he'd wait and see if any woman would take a chance on a Colorado rancher. A rancher whose entire life was built on sand. He blew out the lantern and lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The sound was lonely and haunting, and it matched the feeling in Joe's chest perfectly. 7 years of trying to be someone else. 7 years of building an honest reputation on a foundation of lies. 7 years of hoping that somehow, some way he could make up for what he'd done. But deep down, Joe knew the truth. You couldn't outrun your sins. They followed you wherever you went, casting shadows over everything you built. And Christmas, when it came, would be just like the last 6. A reminder of the worst day of his life and the terrible choice he'd made in the snow outside Pemberton's office. Maybe this Christmas would be different. Maybe a woman would answer his advertisement and bring some light into his dark life. Or maybe he'd spend another year alone with his guilt, counting cattle bought with dirty money and pretending to be someone he wasn't. Either way, Joe Carter would keep working, keep helping, keep trying to earn what couldn't be earned. Because what else could he do? Chapter 4. Holly Bennett sat beside Mrs. Whitmore's bed, holding the old woman's frail hand. The room was dim, just a single lamp burning low on the bedside table. Outside, December snow fell silently past the window. "Sing for me, dear," Mrs. Whitmore whispered. Her voice was so faint that Holly had to lean close to hear. "One of the carols, please." Holly swallowed the lump in her throat and began to sing softly. "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." Mrs. Lee Whitmore's eyes drifted closed. A small smile touched her lips. Holly kept singing, her voice barely louder than a breath, as the old woman's breathing grew slower and slower. "Round yon virgin, mother and child, holy infant so tender and mild." The last breath came so gently that Holly almost didn't notice. One moment, Mrs. Whitmore was there, and the next she was simply gone. Peaceful, quiet, home. Holly finished the verse, tears sliding down her cheeks. She'd worked as Mrs. the Whitmore's companion for 3 years, and in that time the elderly widow had been kinder to her than anyone since Holly's own mother passed. She sat for a long while, still holding the cold hand, not wanting to let go, not wanting to face what came next. Finally, she stood to find Mrs. Whitmore's son. Gerald Whitmore was in his mother's parlor, examining a china tea set with the calculating eye of a man already counting his inheritance. He looked up when Holly entered, his expression shifting to what might have been grief if Holly didn't know him better. "She's gone," Holly said quietly. "Just now, very peacefully." Gerald nodded once. "I'll send for the undertaker." He set down the teacup he'd been holding and turned to face Holly fully. "You'll need to pack your belongings today. I want you out by morning." Holly stared at him. "Tomorrow? But I thought I might stay until after the funeral, to help with arrangements." "That won't be necessary. My wife will handle it." "I see." Holly clasped her hands together to keep them from shaking. "Then I'll collect my wages and be on my way." Gerald's face hardened. "There will be no wages." "I beg your pardon?" "My mother's jewelry box is missing several valuable pieces, a ruby brooch, a gold locket, a string of pearls." His voice was cold, accusatory. "Items that were here when you arrived 3 years ago." Holly's stomach dropped. "I never touched Mrs. Whitmore's jewelry." "I wouldn't." "Nevertheless, they're gone, and you're the only one who had access to her rooms." He crossed his arms. "I should call the police, but I'm willing to be charitable. Leave quietly and I won't press charges. Consider it a kindness." "This is about the will," Holly said, understanding washing over her. "Your mother left me something, didn't she?" Gerald's jaw tightened, confirming it. Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned once that she'd provided for Holly in her will. Nothing substantial, just enough for a fresh start. Apparently, Gerald had found out and decided to make sure Holly never saw a penny of it. "Get out," Gerald said, "before I change my mind about the police." Holly walked upstairs to her small room, her whole body numb. She packed her few belongings into a carpet bag, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. No wages, no reference, no money, and it was just a few weeks before Christmas. She counted the coins in her purse, $3.25, all she had in the world. By noon, she was standing on the snowy streets of Albany, with her bag in hand and nowhere to go. The boarding houses all wanted rent in advance. The shops were hiring for Christmas, but they wanted girls with local references. No one would take a chance on a woman accused of theft, even if the accusation was whispered rather than shouted. Holly walked for hours, her feet growing numb in her worn boots. She passed store windows decorated with ribbons and evergreen boughs. Inside, families shopped for gifts and treats. Outside, Holly tried not to think about how hungry she was or how cold. By evening, she found herself at the train station. It was warm inside, at least, and no one questioned her right to be there. She sat on a wooden bench and watched travelers come and go, Families heading home for Christmas, businessmen rushing to catch their trains. Everyone had somewhere to be, somewhere to belong. Except her. On the bench beside her, someone had left a newspaper. Holly picked it up idly, not really reading, just looking for some distraction from the cold knot of fear in her chest. The Matrimonial Times. She'd seen copies before, but never paid much attention. Letters from men out west seeking wives. It had always seemed desperate, somehow. The last resort of women with no other options, women like her. Holly turned the pages slowly, reading the advertisements. Some were crude, offering little more than a roof and demanding labor in return. Others were grandiose, promising riches that seemed too good to be true. Then one caught her eye. Rancher seeks kind-hearted woman for companionship and shared faith. Must be honest and hard-working. Will provide comfortable home and respect. Write to Joseph Carter, 3 Pines, Colorado. Holly read it twice. This one was different somehow. It didn't promise wealth or make grand claims. It just asked for kindness and faith. 2 qualities Holly had in abundance, even if she had no more than that. She pulled a pencil and paper from her bag. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was doing. Dear Mr. Carter, my name is Holly Bennett. I am 26 years old and currently residing in Albany, New York. I saw your advertisement in the Matrimonial Times and felt moved to respond. I must be honest with you from the start. I have no money and no family. I have just lost my position as a lady's companion under circumstances that were unjust, but which leave me without references. I am not writing to you from a position of strength, but from one of great need. What I can offer you is this. I can cook and sew. I can read and write. I can keep a home clean and manage household accounts. I am a woman of faith, though I confess my faith has been tested greatly these past days. More than anything, I can promise you honesty and hard work. I have learned that luck runs out, but character remains. If you are willing to give me a chance, I will do my best to be a good and faithful companion. If this is not what you are seeking, I understand. I wish you well in your search. Respectfully, Holly Bennett. She read it over 3 times, making small corrections. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. And right now, honesty was all she had to give. Holly posted the letter before she could talk herself out of it. Then she used another precious dollar to rent a cot at a women's boarding house for the night. The room was tiny and cold, with 6 beds crammed together, but it was shelter. She lay awake most of the night, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, writing to a stranger, offering to marry a man she'd never met, and travel to a place she'd never seen. It was madness. But what choice did she have? 2 weeks passed. Holly stretched her remaining money as far as it would go. She took odd jobs where she could find them, washing dishes at a restaurant for a few hours, mending clothes for a seamstress. It was barely enough to keep a roof over her head and a little food in her stomach. Morning arrived, gray and cold. Holly sat in her rented room and tried not to think about past Decembers. Her parents' warm kitchen, the small gifts they'd managed to afford, the feeling of being loved and safe, all gone now. She was just pulling on her coat to go in search of any shops that might need last-minute help when there was a knock at her door. Miss Bennett, letter for you. Holly's heart jumped. She opened the door and took the envelope from the landlady. Colorado postmark. Joseph Carter. Her hands shook as she opened it. Dear Miss Bennett, your letter moved me deeply. I admire your honesty and respect your courage in writing despite difficult circumstances. I am not a man of great means, but I have a working ranch in Colorado and a home that needs a woman's touch. More than that, I have been searching for someone who values faith and character over wealth and status. Your letter suggests you are such a woman. I have enclosed a train ticket to 3 Pines, Colorado. If you are still willing, I would be honored to meet you and discuss the possibility of marriage. We could both use a new beginning by Christmas. If you have doubts or reservations, I understand. The ticket is yours either way, no obligations. But I hope you will come. Respectfully, Joseph Carter. Holly sank onto her bed, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. A train ticket. A chance. A man who asked for faith and honesty instead of beauty and youth. It felt like providence. She pulled out her carpet bag and began to pack. There wasn't much to organize: a few dresses, all worn and mended, her mother's Bible, a small wooden box containing her parents' wedding rings, the only valuable objects she owned, and the only ones she'd never consider selling. By evening, she was at the train station with her ticket in hand. The westbound train wouldn't leave until morning, but Holly didn't want to risk missing it. She spent the night on a bench, her bag clutched to her chest, watching the clock and praying that she was heading to a kind man and that kindness waited at the end of this journey. When dawn broke on that crisp winter morning, Holly boarded the train. As it pulled away from Albany, she watched the city disappear behind her. All she'd known, all that was familiar. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and a letter from a stranger promising a new beginning. Holly pressed her hand against the window glass and whispered another prayer, not for wealth or comfort, but for that which was simpler and infinitely more precious: a place to belong, a name that wasn't ruined, a home where she could be safe. The train carried her west, away from scandal and shame, toward a rancher in Colorado who'd asked for kindness and faith. Holly had both to give. She only hoped it would be enough. Chapter 5. Holly boarded the westbound train on a cold December morning, with her single carpet bag clutched in one hand and her ticket in the other. The hope of having a home by Christmas felt fragile, like a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. But it was hope nonetheless, and she clung to it. The train was crowded with holiday travelers. Holly found a seat in a passenger car near the back, wedging herself between a farmer's wife carrying a basket of apples and a young man in a worn suit who seemed to be sleeping off a night of celebration. As the train pulled away from Albany, Holly watched the city disappear behind her. The familiar buildings and streets faded into the distance until all that was left was the snow-covered countryside stretching endlessly ahead. She was leaving it all behind. Her parents' graves, tangible reminders of Mrs. Whitmore, the scandal of Gerald's accusations, all of it shrinking into the past with every mile the train traveled west. The journey was long and uncomfortable. The passenger car was cold, despite the small stove at one end. Holly wrapped herself tighter in her shawl and tried to doze, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept spinning with questions and worries. What if Joseph Carter wasn't the kind man his letter suggested? What if she arrived in Colorado only to find herself in worse circumstances than before? But then she'd remember the gentle honesty of his words. We could both use a new beginning by Christmas. A man who wrote like that couldn't be cruel. Could he? The train made frequent stops. At each station, Holly watched passengers come and go, families reuniting, merchants haggling over freight, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing even as hers hung suspended between one world and another. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, a young mother boarded with a crying infant. The woman looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, her dress stained and wrinkled. She settled into the seat across from Holly, trying desperately to quiet the child. "Hush now, sweetness," the mother murmured, rocking the baby. "Please, hush." But the infant only cried harder, his wails filling the car. Other passengers began to shift uncomfortably, shooting annoyed glances at the mother. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment. Holly leaned forward. "May I try?" The mother looked up, gratitude and desperation warring in her expression. "Would you? I've been traveling since yesterday, and I think he's just tired of being held the same way." Holly took the baby gently. He was perhaps 6 months old, with red cheeks and tiny fists. She held him against her shoulder and began to hum softly, one of the carols her own mother used to sing, "Away in a manger, no crib for a bed." The baby's cries began to quiet. Holly swayed slightly, continuing to hum. She could feel the infant's body relaxing against her, his breathing evening out. "You're a natural," the mother whispered. "Do you have children?" "No," Holly said softly, "but I helped care for several when I worked as a companion." Within minutes, the baby was asleep. Holly carefully passed him back to his grateful mother, who mouthed a silent thank you. Holly settled back in her seat, but she could feel the eyes of other passengers on her. Small smiles, approving nods. It felt good to be seen as capable and kind, rather than as a woman under suspicion of theft. Maybe in Colorado, she could be that person, someone who helped, someone who belonged. The train rolled on through Indiana, then Illinois. In Chicago, Holly had to change trains. She stood on the platform, shivering in the bitter wind that whipped off Lake Michigan, and waited for the westbound express. This train was even more crowded. Holly ended up standing for several hours until a seat finally opened when the train was nearing Omaha. Her feet ached and her back was sore, but she didn't complain. This discomfort was temporary. It was carrying her toward a better life. At a small frontier stop in Wyoming, the train paused to take on water. Holly stepped onto the platform to stretch her legs. The air was crisp and thin, so different from Albany's heavy dampness. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white with snow. A bulletin board stood near the station door. Holly walked over to it, curious about this frontier world she was entering. Most of the notices were mundane: cattle for sale, a reward for a lost dog, church service times. Then she saw the wanted posters. They fluttered in the wind, pinned haphazardly to the board, rough sketches of men's faces above descriptions of their crimes: horse theft, murder, bank robbery. Holly studied them with a mixture of fascination and fear. These were the dangers of the West, the lawlessness that made civilized people back east shake their heads and declare the frontier too wild for decent folk. That last line caught her attention now in a way it hadn't before. What did he mean by that? What had Joseph Carter been that he needed to become someone else? Everyone had a past, she supposed. She certainly did. Maybe he'd simply made mistakes and wanted to start fresh, just like her. The train pushed through a snowstorm in the Rockies. For hours, all Holly could see through the window was white. The world reduced to nothing but snow and the rhythmic clack of wheels on rails. She dozed fitfully, her head resting against the cold glass. When she woke, the storm had passed, and the sun was setting over Colorado, painting the mountains pink and gold. They were getting close now. Just a few more hours to Three Pines. Holly's stomach twisted with nerves. What if he took one look at her and changed his mind? She wasn't beautiful. Her dress was worn and mended. She had little to offer but her willingness to work and her determination to build a good life. Would that be enough? She pulled out her mother's Bible and held it in her lap. The leather was soft and warm from years of her mother's hands holding it. Holly traced the gold letters on the cover. "Mama," she whispered, "I hope I'm doing right. I hope you'd be proud of me for having the courage to try." As darkness threatened on that cold December day, the train finally pulled into Three Pines. The station was small, barely more than a platform and a shed, but a few lamps glowed against the darkness, and Holly could see a figure standing beneath one of them. A man in a heavy coat and hat, his breath steaming in the cold air. Joseph Carter. It had to be. Holly gathered her bag and stood on shaking legs. This was it, the moment that would determine her entire future. She stepped down from the train onto the platform. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked toward the man by the lamp. He was watching her, waiting. Holly took a deep breath and whispered one final prayer. Let there still be kindness waiting. Then she walked forward into her new life. Chapter 6. Joe stood beneath the platform lamp, snow dusting the brim of his hat. He held a lantern in one hand, the warm light casting a golden circle around him in the darkness. His breath steamed in the cold air, and his heart hammered against his ribs. What if she took one look at him and changed her mind? He'd scrubbed himself clean, put on his best shirt, and even trimmed his beard. But he was still just a rancher with worn boots and work-roughened hands, and a past he could never fully wash away. The train hissed and groaned as it came to a stop. Joe watched passengers begin to disembark. A family with 3 children, an older gentleman in a suit, a cowhand heading home for Christmas. Then he saw her, a woman in a dark coat and a worn shawl, carrying a single carpet bag. She stepped down from the train carefully, looking around with wide eyes. Her auburn hair was mostly hidden beneath her bonnet, but he could see strands of it catching the lamplight. Holly Bennett. It had to be. She turned, and their eyes met across the platform. For a moment, neither one moved. Joe took a breath and walked toward her. As he got closer, he could see her face more clearly. Plain, the world might call her, but what could be seen in her gray-green eyes struck him. Intelligence, strength, and underneath it all, fear barely hidden. "Miss Bennett?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Mr. Carter." She nodded, clutching her bag tighter. Thank you for meeting me. Of course, I'm glad you came. Joe gestured toward the wagon. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. I hope the journey wasn't too hard on you. It was fine. She followed him to the wagon, her steps quick despite the obvious exhaustion in her face. Long, but fine. Joe helped her up onto the wagon seat, trying not to notice how light she felt, how thin her coat was for a Colorado winter. Once she was settled, he climbed up beside her and took the reins. The wagon pulled away from the station, heading into the darkness beyond Three Pines. Snow fell gently, muffling the sound of the horses' hooves. For several minutes, neither spoke. Joe searched for words and found none that were adequate. What did you say to a woman who traveled halfway across the country to marry you based on a few letters? It's beautiful here, Holly said finally, breaking the silence. The mountains, the snow, it's so different from Albany. It can be harsh, Joe said. Winters are long, summers are short. It takes a certain kind of person to make a life here. I'm willing to try. Joe glanced at her. Even in the darkness, he could see the determination in her profile. Your letter said you lost your position unjustly. If you don't mind me asking, what happened? Holly was quiet for a moment. The woman I worked for passed away. Her son accused me of stealing jewelry so he wouldn't have to honor his mother's will. There was nothing I could do. No way to prove my innocence. Her voice was steady, but Joe heard the hurt underneath. So I left with nothing, no reference, no wages, just the clothes I owned and $3. That's a hard blow. It was. But sometimes the hardest blows lead us where we need to go. She turned to look at him. Your letter gave me hope when I had none. I'm grateful for that, whatever happens next. Joe felt guilt twist in his chest. She was grateful to him. A thief. A man living under a false name. If she knew the truth, she'd climb back on that train and never look back. There's a fact I should tell you, Joe said, then paused. What could he say? Not the whole truth. Not yet. But something. About Christmas. Out here on the frontier, folks have customs that might seem strange to someone from back east. What kind of customs? We burn candles, not for decoration or celebration, for remembrance. The words came slowly. To guide lost souls home, to honor those who've passed, to mark the distance between who we were and who we hope to become. Holly absorbed this. That's beautiful. Sad, but beautiful. I lit one tonight, before coming to meet you. Joe kept his eyes on the road ahead. An old tradition my mother taught me. She said a candle in the window means someone's waiting. Someone cares enough to leave a light burning. I like that, Holly said softly. The idea that someone's waiting, that you're not forgotten. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The snow continued to fall, coating the landscape in white. In the distance, Joe could see the dim outline of his cabin, and yes, the candle flickering in the window. He'd lit it before leaving, not quite sure why. Maybe hoping it would make the cabin feel more welcoming. Maybe hoping it would guide him back to what might be redemption. There, he said, pointing. That's home. Holly leaned forward, squinting through the snow. When she saw the candle, her face softened. You really did light one. Told you I would. As they drew closer, Holly could see the cabin more clearly. Simple but solid. Smoke curling from the chimney. The golden glow of candlelight in the window making it look warm and safe. Joe helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag to the door. Inside, the cabin was neat and clean. He'd spent all afternoon making sure of it. The floor was swept, the dishes washed, and a fire was burning in the stove. Holly stood in the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. One room, a bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with books and supplies, the candle burning steadily in the window. It's not much, Joe said, but it's honest work that built it. The lie tasted bitter even as he said it. It's lovely, Holly said, and she sounded like she meant it. It's more than I hoped for. Joe busied himself at the stove, ladling soup into bowls. Figured you'd be hungry after the journey. It's just beef and vegetables, nothing fancy. They sat at the small table and ate. The soup was good, hot and filling. Holly ate slowly, savoring each mouthful like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. This is wonderful, she said. Did you make it yourself? Had to learn when I came out here. No choice. You mentioned in your letter that Colorado is a place where a man can become what he ought to have been. Holly set down her spoon and looked at him directly. What did you mean by that? Joe's hand froze halfway to his mouth. He set his spoon down carefully. I meant that sometimes a man makes mistakes, takes wrong turns. Out here, there's space to start over, to build something better. We all make mistakes, Holly said quietly. I trusted the wrong people, believed that loyalty would be rewarded. I learned otherwise. And yet you're still trusting. You came all this way to meet a stranger. Faith isn't about certainty, it's about hope. She smiled slightly. Besides, I didn't have much choice. Trust you or freeze on the streets of Albany. Joe stood and walked to a small wooden box on the shelf. He opened it and pulled out a simple brooch. The metal was tarnished, the design old-fashioned, but it had been his mother's, and it was precious to him. He returned to the table and held it out to Holly. This was my mother's. It's not worth much in money, but it meant the world to her. I want you to have it. Holly's eyes widened. I can't. It's too much. Please. Joe pressed it into her hand. So you'll know you belong here. So you'll know you're welcome. Holly's fingers closed around the brooch, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered. No one's given me anything in so long, Zara. No one's made me feel like I mattered. You do matter. And if you'll have me, if you'll give this life a chance, I promise I'll do my best to be worthy of your trust. The words burned coming out. How could he promise to be worthy when his entire life was built on theft and lies? They finished supper in silence. Joe showed Holly where she could sleep, the bed in the corner with clean blankets he'd aired that morning. He'd sleep in the bunkhouse with his men until they were properly married. Thank you, Holly said again, for all you have done, for the chance. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the wedding. We'll figure out the rest as we go. After Holly retired behind the curtain he'd strung up for privacy, Joe sat alone at the table. The candle still burned in the window, its flame steady and bright. He pulled out his mother's Bible and opened it to a random page. His eyes fell on a verse about redemption, about God's mercy being new every morning. Joe closed the Bible and bowed his head. Ma, he whispered, if goodness can't erase what I did, can it at least cover it? Can I be good enough for her? I want to build a clean life on top of the dirty foundation. I know I don't deserve mercy, but maybe she does. Maybe if I can make her life better, that counts for something. The candle flickered, but didn't go out. Joe sat in the quiet cabin, listening to Holly's soft breathing from behind the curtain. A stranger who'd trusted him, a woman who'd put her future in his hands based on only a few honest words in a letter. If only she knew how dishonest the rest of him was. But maybe, Joe thought, maybe he could become the man she thought he was. Maybe if he tried hard enough, worked hard enough, loved well enough, he could grow into the person she deserved. Or maybe the past would catch up with him first, and she'd learn the truth about Joseph Mallory, the thief from New York who'd stolen money and run west to hide. For tonight, though, she was safe, warm, fed, sleeping peacefully in his cabin while snow fell outside and a candle burned in the window. Tomorrow was their wedding day, a day for miracles and new beginnings. Joe could only pray that he'd be granted both. Chapter 7. Holly woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned. Colorado, Joseph Carter's ranch. The morning of her wedding. She dressed quickly behind the curtain and emerged to find the cabin empty. Through the window, she could see the world transformed. Fresh snow blanketed all she could see, making the landscape look clean and new. The mountains in the distance gleamed white against the blue sky. The door opened and Joe stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He looked surprised to see her awake. Morning, he said. Sleep well? Good morning to you. I did, thank you. Joe moved to the stove and began stoking the fire. I was just doing morning chores, feeding the cattle, checking on the horses. If you're willing, I could use some help before we head to church. Holly nodded. Of course, that's why I'm here. Joe handed her a heavy coat that had belonged to his mother. It was too large, but it was warm. Together they walked out into the cold morning air. The cattle stood in a rough corral, their breath steaming. Joe showed Holly how to break the ice on the water trough and scatter hay for the herd. The work was simple but satisfying. Holly found herself enjoying the rhythm of it, the way the animals responded to care. You're a natural, Joe said, watching her. Most city folk are afraid of cattle. I'm not afraid of hard work, never have been. They worked side by side until the chores were finished. Back in the cabin, Joe poured them both coffee while Holly warmed herself by the stove. "I have a gift for you," Joe said quietly. He pulled a small object from his pocket, wrapped in a cloth. "It's not much. Wanted to give it to you before the ceremony today." Holly unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a wooden cross, small enough to fit in her palm. The wood was smooth and polished, the craftsmanship simple but careful. Someone had carved it by hand with patience and skill. "You made this?" Joe nodded, looking embarrassed. "Worked on it in the evenings. It ain't store-bought, but it's honest." Holly ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into each cut, each sanded edge. "It's beautiful. Thank you." She looked up at him and saw relief in his face, as if he'd been worried she'd reject such a humble gift. "I'll treasure it," she said, and meant it. They got ready for church service. Holly washed up and changed into her best dress, pinning both Joe's mother's brooch and the wooden cross he had made to her collar. The combination felt right, old and new, past and future. They rode into Three Pines in the wagon. The small church stood at the end of the main street, its white steeple bright against the mountains. It was early, yet. The Reverend had arranged to marry Joe and Holly before the congregants arrived for the Sunday service. Joe helped Holly down from the wagon. Her feet had barely touched the snow-covered ground when Reverend Walsh appeared, smiling broadly. "Joe, and this must be Miss Bennett. Welcome, welcome." "Thank you, Reverend." "Well, it's a big day, isn't it? Let's get you two married, and then we can all commune for the word of God when the townsfolk are all here." "For the moment, we have the 2 witnesses you asked to be here, Joe. They're staying warm inside." Inside, the church was simple but lovely. Wooden pews, a plain altar, windows that let in the winter light. Joe introduced her to the witnesses. The first was his hired hand, young Tommy, who could not believe that Joe had asked him to witness such an auspicious moment in his life. The second was Widow Patterson, who always seemed to have just the right advice for any of the townsfolk who were having relationship problems. Holly thanked them for taking the trouble to be there early to witness the union, and Reverend Walsh wasted no time conducting the wedding ceremony. People were gathering outside when Joe and Holly left the church as husband and wife, leaving the widow inside the warm church with Tommy to keep her company. The townsfolk were bundled in their winter coats, greeting each other warmly. Several people turned to look at them, curiosity plain on their faces. "Come, let me introduce you to some folks," Reverend Walsh motioned. The next few minutes passed in a blur of names and handshakes. Miss Thompson, the schoolteacher, Mr. and Mrs. Garrett, who ran the general store, the Martinez family with their 4 children. Everyone was welcoming, their greetings genuine. But Holly also heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks exchanged between neighbors. "That's Joe Carter's mail-order bride. Came all the way from New York. He's always been generous. Paid to fix the school porch just last month. Gave beef to the Christmas larder, too. Good man." Holly felt Joe tense beside her. He didn't seem comfortable with the praise, almost like it pained him to hear it. Holly and Joe made their way into the church before the service and sat near the back. The service began with hymns, and Holly lifted her voice with the others. "O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant." Joe sang too, his voice deep and steady, but when they moved to the next hymn, something changed. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Holly felt Joe's voice falter beside her. She glanced at him and saw sadness etched in his face. His jaw was tight, his eyes focused somewhere far away. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The words seemed to cut through him. Holly reached over and gently touched his hand. Joe looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. Something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or comfort. Reverend Walsh preached about forgiveness, about how the upcoming Christmas was God's gift of mercy to a broken world, about how no sin was too great to be washed clean by grace. Holly saw Joe's hands clench in his lap. His shoulders hunched forward slightly as if carrying a heavy weight. What burden was he carrying? After the service, they lingered while people filed out. Several folks stopped to congratulate them. Miss Thompson invited them for dinner next Sunday. Mr. Garrett mentioned that the general store had some fabric that might interest Holly. Joe accepted the invitations politely, but Holly could tell he was eager to leave. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The joy of the morning had given way to a more somber sense. Joe's face was troubled, his mind clearly elsewhere. Back at the cabin, Holly prepared a simple dinner that was a touch more elaborate than the norm. Roasted chicken, potatoes, bread. Joe sat at the table watching her work, still lost in thought. "The service was lovely," Holly said, trying to draw him out. "The people here seem kind." "They are. You have a good reputation here. Everyone speaks highly of you." Joe's jaw tightened. "They don't know everything." Holly set down the knife she'd been using to slice bread. "Joe, what's troubling you? You can talk to me." "It's nothing, just old memories of December time. Everyone has them." But Holly knew it was more than that. She'd seen the way he'd reacted during the hymns about forgiveness, the way he'd tensed when people praised his generosity, the sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes. After dinner, Joe excused himself and walked outside. Holly watched him through the window. He stood near the corral, staring at the mountains, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. She cleaned up the dishes, then pulled on the heavy coat and followed him out. Joe didn't turn when she approached. He just kept staring at the distant peaks, his breath visible in the cold air. "It's beautiful country," Holly said quietly. "It is. You seem burdened somehow. If you want to talk about it, I'm willing to listen." Joe was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Still can't pay what I owe." Holly frowned. "Are you in debt? Is the ranch struggling?" "Not that kind of debt." "Then what kind?" Joe shook his head. "Just old regrets. Mistakes I can't fix." Holly moved closer. "We all have regrets. I have my own. Maybe that's what brought us both here. Two people trying to start over." "What if starting over isn't enough? What if some mistakes can't be undone?" "Then you live with them and try to be better. That's all anyone can do." Joe turned to look at her then. His blue eyes were filled with pain. "You're too good, Holly. Too trusting. I'm not naive. I know life is hard. I know people make mistakes. But I also know that character shows itself over time. And all that I've seen tells me you're a good man trying to live right. If only she knew." Holly assumed he meant debts from hardship. Maybe someone had helped him start the ranch, and he felt the weight of that obligation. Or perhaps he'd lost someone and couldn't forgive himself for not saving them. She had no idea that the man beside her was living under a false name, that he'd stolen thousands of dollars and fled across the country, that all he owned was built on a foundation of crime. She saw only what he'd become, not what he'd been. "Thank you," Joe said quietly, "for not pushing, for being patient with me. We have time to learn about each other. There's no rush." They stood there in the snow, watching the sun begin to set behind the mountains. The sky turned pink and gold, painting the snow in warm colors. Inside the cabin, the candle still burned in the window, a small light against the gathering darkness. Holly didn't know the truth about Joe's past, but she could see his present, could see the man who carved wooden crosses by firelight, who fed his cattle with care, who'd welcomed a stranger into his home and given her hope when she had none. Whatever shadows haunted him, she was willing to stand beside him while he faced them. As darkness fell on their wedding day, they went back inside. Joe built up the fire while Holly made coffee. They sat at the small table in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. For Holly, it was the first December in years when she hadn't felt completely alone. For Joe, it was both comfort and torment. This good woman trusted him, believed in him, saw him as someone worth knowing, if only he deserved it. Chapter 8. The stranger arrived in Three Pines on a cold morning 2 weeks before Christmas. He rode a dusty gray horse and wore a long brown duster that had seen better days. His face was lean and weathered, with gray at the temples and eyes the color of cold steel. He tied his horse at the hitching post outside the marshal's office and stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. Marshal Tom Hendricks looked up from his desk. He was an older man, more interested in keeping the peace than chasing trouble. "Help you, Marshal?" The stranger extended his hand. "Name's Nate Briggs. I'm a cattle buyer from Wyoming, looking to purchase stock in the area." The marshal shook his hand. "Welcome to Three Pines. Not much cattle business this time of year, but there are a few ranchers who might be willing to sell. Appreciate that. Nate pulled a folded paper from his coat. I also carry these as a courtesy. Wanted circulars. Sometimes criminals drift west, thinking they can disappear. Just thought you might want them for reference. Marshall Hendricks took the papers and glanced through them. Horse thieves, bank robbers, one for a theft in New York, 7 years old. Much obliged, though we don't get much trouble here. Three Pines is a quiet town, honest folk for the most part. Those are the best kind. Nate tipped his hat. Any ranchers you'd recommend I talk to? Joseph Carter's got a decent operation about an hour west. Good man, fair dealer. Nate filed the name away. Joseph Carter. I'll pay him a visit. Thank you, Marshall. After leaving the marshal's office, Nate walked down the main street. The town was small but prosperous. A general store, a church, a saloon, and a few other businesses. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. He stopped at the general store and bought tobacco. While the clerk wrapped it, Nate made casual conversation. Just got into town. Marshall mentioned a rancher named Joseph Carter. You know him? The clerk nodded enthusiastically. Sure do. Joe's one of our best customers. Honest as the day is long. Always pays his bills on time. That's good to hear. I'm looking to buy cattle. You'll want to talk to him then. He's built up a nice herd over the years. Works hard. Treats his men fair. Just got himself a wife, too. Pretty lady from back east. Nate absorbed this information. A wife. That complicated matters. He left the store and walked to the saloon. It was quiet this time of day, just a few men nursing drinks. Nate ordered whiskey and struck up a conversation with the bartender. I hear Joseph Carter's a good man to do business with. The best, the bartender said. Been here about 7 years. Built his ranch from nothing. Always willing to help folks out. Fixed the school porch last month with his own hands and lumber. Gave beef to the Christmas larder, too. 7 years. The timeline matched. Sounds like a pillar of the community. He is. Quiet man. Keeps to himself mostly, but when someone needs help, Joe's always there. Nate finished his whiskey and paid. He stepped back onto the street, his mind working through what he'd learned. Everyone spoke highly of Joseph Carter. Honest, generous, hard-working. But Nate had seen the marshal's description of Carter when he'd glanced at the wanted circular. About 30 years old, dark hair, tall build from years of physical labor. And there was something else. When Nate had mentioned the name to the clerk, he'd seen the man's eyes flick to a scar above his own eyebrow, as if remembering a similar mark on Carter's face. Nate walked back to his horse and rode out of town, heading west toward Carter's ranch. He wasn't going there today. Not yet, but he wanted to see the place. Get a feel for the man he was tracking. The ranch came into view after about an hour. Modest but well-maintained. A cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. A barn and corral. Cattle grazing in the snow-covered pasture. Nate watched from a distance. He saw a woman come out of the cabin, wrapped in a heavy coat. She scattered feed for chickens, moving with practiced efficiency. The new wife, probably. Then a man emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired. Even from this distance, Nate could make out the deliberate way he moved. The way his left arm didn't quite straighten when he reached for something. Joseph Carter, or Joseph Mallory. Nate studied him for a long time. The man worked alongside his wife, helping with the morning chores. There was nothing furtive about him. No sign of a man hiding from his past. He looked like exactly what the townspeople said he was, an honest rancher living an honest life. But Nate had learned long ago that appearances could deceive. He turned his horse and rode back toward town. He'd seen enough for now. Over the next few days, Nate established himself in Three Pines. He rented a room at the boarding house. He talked to more ranchers about cattle. He made himself a familiar presence so that when he finally approached Carter, it would seem natural. And everywhere he went, he heard the same story. Joseph Carter was a good man, generous, honest, trustworthy. It should have made Nate's job easier. Clear-cut case. Catch the thief, collect the reward, move on. But instead, he found himself troubled. He'd hunted plenty of men over the years. Some were obviously guilty, unrepentant criminals who'd hurt people without remorse. Those were easy. Justice was clear. But Carter didn't fit that pattern. Whatever he'd done 7 years ago, he'd spent the time since trying to make amends. The whole town testified to his character. Was that redemption? Or just a clever disguise? Nate sat in his boarding house room at night, reading through his file on the Mallory case. The theft had been opportunistic. A man driven to desperation by grief and injustice. Not a hardened criminal, just someone who'd made a terrible choice in a terrible moment. Still, the law was the law, and Nate had a job to do. A few days later, Nate was at the general store when the door opened and Holly Carter walked in. She was bundled against the cold, her cheeks pink from the wind. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," the clerk called out. "How's ranch life treating you?" "Very well, thank you." Holly smiled, and Nate could see genuine contentment in her face. "I need some flour and sugar when you have a moment." Nate pretended to examine some rope while he listened. "Your husband's a good man," the clerk said while measuring out flour. "We're all glad he found someone to share his life with." "He is good," Holly said softly, "better than he knows." The words struck Nate. There was a measure in her tone. Not just affection, but loyalty, protection even. "He works too hard sometimes," Holly continued. "I have to remind him to rest. He's always trying to help someone, always worrying about doing right by people. Always worrying about doing right." The words of a man carrying guilt. Holly finished her purchase and left. Nate waited a few minutes, then followed her outside. He timed it so they'd cross paths on the street. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Nate Briggs, new to town, cattle buyer." Holly paused. "Holly Carter, welcome to Three Pines. I've heard good words about your husband. I'm hoping to discuss business with him soon. He's honest in his dealings. I'm sure you'll find him fair." Nate nodded. "Everyone speaks highly of him. Seems like he's made quite a life here." "He has. We both have." There was a protective edge to Holly's voice now. "If you'll excuse me, I need to get home." She walked past him toward the wagon. But as she did, Nate spoke again, not to her, but loud enough for her to overhear. "Strange case I heard about recently," he said to the clerk who'd followed him out. "A thief who ran at Christmas. 7 years ago, back east, man named Mallory. Stole money after a warehouse accident killed his family. Never been caught." Nate watched Holly's back. She'd frozen mid-step. Just for a second. Then she kept walking, but her shoulders were tense. She'd heard, and something about it had affected her. Nate felt a pang of guilt. He was using her to get to Carter. But that was the job. That evening, Joe came into town for supplies. Nate noticed him riding into town and made his way to the general store, anticipating that he would stop in there while he was in town. They were standing near each other when Joe reached for a box on a high shelf. His left arm extended, but it didn't straighten fully, the old break that Maggie Jones had described. Joe turned, and their eyes met. For just a moment, Nate saw recognition flash across the other man's face. Not recognition of Nate specifically, but recognition of what Nate represented. Danger. Joe's face went carefully neutral. "Excuse me," he said, moving past. "No trouble." Nate studied him. The scar above the right eye, the weathered face, the quiet wariness of a man with secrets. This was Joseph Mallory. Nate was certain now. He watched Joe pay for his supplies and leave quickly. Too quickly. The easy manner from before was gone, replaced by tension. Nate had rattled him. The mention of the Christmas theft, combined with a stranger asking questions, had put Carter on alert. Good. Nervous men made mistakes. That night, Joe returned to the ranch with his supplies. Holly was already asleep, exhausted from the day's work. Joe lit a single candle and sat at his desk. He pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom drawer. Inside were the only objects he'd kept from his old life. A faded photograph of his family, his mother's wedding ring, and the old company ledgers from Pemberton Shipping. He'd kept the ledgers all these years as proof. Proof that the company had been corrupt, that they'd ignored safety concerns, that his father and brother had died because of negligence. The ledgers were his justification, his excuse for what he'd done. They had been in the safe on that fateful day 7 years back, and he had taken them, although he didn't know why at the time. He had been led to take them by a force he could not explain, even now. But looking at them tonight, they just felt like anchors. Evidence of his crime. Proof of the theft that could send him to prison. Joe took the ledgers and the other items and wrapped them carefully in oilcloth. Then he pried up a loose floorboard and hid them beneath, covering the spot with a rug. If anyone came looking, they wouldn't find these. They were the only physical links to Joseph Mallory. But Joe knew that hiding evidence wouldn't save him. The stranger with the cold eyes wasn't just a cattle buyer. Joe had seen men like that before. Pinkerton agents, bounty hunters, men who tracked fugitives for money. He'd been found. After 7 years of running, 7 years of trying to build a good existence, his past had finally caught up with him. Joe blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, listening to Holly's soft breathing from the bed. She trusted him, believed in him, had built her hopes around the life they were creating together. And he was going to lose it all. Chapter 9. The days following Nate Briggs's arrival in Three Pines were tense ones for Joe. He went about his work with forced normalcy, but his mind never stopped racing. Every sound made him turn. Every stranger's face made him wonder. Holly noticed the change. How could she not? The man who'd been slowly opening up to her had retreated behind walls again. He was distant at meals, distracted during chores. He spent long hours outside, even when there was no work to be done, staring at the mountains as if searching for answers in their peaks. "Joe," Holly said one evening as they sat at the table, "something's wrong. Please talk to me." "It's nothing, just tired." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. A week after Nate's arrival, Joe rode into town for supplies. Holly stayed behind to clean the cabin. It was a task she'd been putting off, wanting to make the place more truly hers, but hesitant to disturb Joe's carefully ordered world. She started with the main room, swept the floor, washed the windows, and aired the blankets. Then she moved to Joe's desk in the corner. It was neat but dusty, papers stacked carefully. Holly began dusting around the papers, trying not to disturb them. But as she moved a stack aside, something underneath caught her eye. A rug that didn't lie quite flat, as if something beneath the floorboards pushed it up slightly. She shouldn't look. It was Joe's private space. But the unevenness bothered her. If there was a loose board, it should be fixed before someone tripped. Holly lifted the rug and saw that one board was indeed loose. She pried it up carefully, intending just to check if it needed a nail. Instead, she found an oilcloth package. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph of a family, a simple gold ring, and 2 leather-bound ledgers. The photograph showed a man, a woman, and 2 boys. One of the boys looked like a younger version of Joe. Same dark hair, same serious expression, but the name written on the back read, Mallory Family, 1868. Mallory, not Carter. Holly's stomach dropped. She opened the first ledger with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with columns of numbers, shipping manifests, and dates. At the top of each page, stamped in faded ink, Pemberton Shipping Company, New York, where Joe claimed he'd never been. The second ledger was similar, but with notes in the margins. Notes in Joe's handwriting, notes about safety violations, worn cables, ignored warnings, and at the bottom of one page, in angry strokes, they knew. They knew and did nothing. Holly sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. The ledgers were dated 1871, 7 years ago, the year the stranger in town had mentioned. The theft at Christmas. She heard the wagon outside. Joe was back from town. Holly quickly rewrapped the package and put it back under the floorboard, but she left the rug folded, the board exposed. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen. Joe came through the door carrying supplies. He froze when he saw Holly sitting on the floor beside his desk, the loose board visible between them. "Holly," his face went pale. "I can explain. Who are you?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Who are you really?" Joe set down the supplies slowly. He looked at the exposed floorboard, then at Holly's face, and seemed to age 10 years in that moment. "My name is Joseph Mallory. I was born in New York. Whatever I told you about my mother dying was true. And my father and brother," his voice broke, "they died in an accident at the docks, Christmas time 7 years ago." Holly stood, her legs unsteady. "The ledgers, they're from a shipping company. Pemberton Shipping, where my father and brother worked, where I worked." Joe sat heavily in a chair. "They died because the company ignored safety warnings. Cables that should have been replaced. Timber stacked too high. The owner knew. He knew and did nothing because replacing equipment cost money. And after they died," Joe was silent for a long time, "he fired me. Said I was slowing production by grieving. told me to collect my final wages on Christmas Eve. He looked up at Holly, his eyes full of pain. When I got there, the safe was open. The owner was gone, probably home with his family, enjoying Christmas. And there was all that money. Money that should have gone to safety. Money that killed my father and brother. Holly felt tears prick her eyes. So you took it. I took it. And I took those ledgers as well as the $2,300. I told myself it was justice, that I was owed for what they'd taken from me. But the truth is, I was just angry and broken and desperate. Joe's hands clenched into fists. I ran, came west, used the money to buy this land and start over. As Joseph Carter. As someone new. Someone who could leave Joseph Mallory and his crime behind. He looked around the cabin. I thought if I worked hard enough, did enough good, maybe I could make up for it. Every good deed since was to pay back what I took from the world. Holly absorbed this, her mind reeling. The generous rancher everyone praised. The man who fixed porches and donated beef and hired outcasts. It was all penance. All an attempt to earn redemption he didn't believe he deserved. The stranger in town, she said suddenly. The one who mentioned a thief at Christmas. He's looking for you. I know. That's why you've been so distant. Joe nodded. I knew this day would come eventually. I hoped I'd have more time. Time to become someone worthy of you. Time to build a real life before it all came crashing down. Holly walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered ranch. All she could see had been built with stolen money. The cabin, the barn, the cattle grazing in the pasture, even the coat she wore had been bought with ill-gotten gains. You lied to me, she said quietly, about all of it, your name, your past, the origin of all this. I know, and I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you, so many times I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you'd leave, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. I've been alone for so long, Holly. When you came, when you trusted me, it felt like maybe I could have something good, something real. I know I don't deserve it. I know I don't deserve you, but I wanted it anyway. Holly turned to face him. Tears were streaming down her cheeks now. I came here because I was falsely accused of theft. Do you understand that? I was called a thief when I'd done nothing wrong. I lost all I had because of a lie. Her voice rose. And now I find out that I've married an actual thief, that I'm living in a home built on stolen money. I know. You've built your life on sin, Holly said, the words cutting through the room like a knife. And I'm part of it now. All that I am, all that I hope to become here, it's all tainted by what you did. Joe flinched as if she'd struck him. I'll go to the marshal. I'll confess. I'll face whatever consequences come. You can say you didn't know. The town will believe you. They'll help you. Miss Thompson, the Reverend, they'll make sure you're taken care of. And what about me? Holly's voice broke. What about what I want? I thought I'd found safety, belonging, a man who was good and honest and kind, someone I could build a life with. I wanted to be that man. I tried to be that man. But you're not. The words came out harsh, angry. You're a thief and a liar, and I'm a fool for believing in you. Holly grabbed her coat from the peg by the door. She needed air, needed space to think. Holly, wait. But she was already out the door, stumbling into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall, but she didn't care. She walked blindly away from the cabin, away from Joe, away from the life she'd thought she was building. The snowstorm was picking up, wind whipping around her. She should go back. It was dangerous to be out in this weather. But going back meant facing Joe, facing the truth, facing the fact that once again she'd trusted the wrong person. Once again, she'd been betrayed. Holly walked until her legs gave out. She sank into the snow, her coat already dusted white. Sobs tore through her chest, for her lost hopes, for Joe's sins, for the impossible situation they'd both landed in. Behind her, back at the cabin, Joe stood at the window watching her disappear into the storm. The candle still burned on the sill, its light steady despite the wind rattling the glass. He wanted to go after her, wanted to beg her forgiveness, wanted to promise he'd make it right somehow. But how could he? There was no making this right. He was Joseph Mallory, thief. The kind man she'd married didn't exist, had never existed. It was all just a lie he'd told himself. A story about redemption that ignored the simple truth. You couldn't build something clean on a foundation of sin. Joe sank into his chair and stared at the candle flame. It flickered but didn't go out. burning steady and bright in the window, a light for lost souls to find their way home. But Joe was the lost soul, and he dragged Holly down with him. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering her tracks, covering their mistakes, covering all of it in cold, unforgiving white. Chapter 10. The snow fell thick and steady outside the second-floor window of Maggie Jones's boarding house. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the street below, where lamplight fought to push back the December dark. Her breath fogged the pain, and she rubbed it clear with the heel of her hand. Somewhere far out west, in a place called Colorado, a man she once knew was building a life. Or maybe that life was about to crumble. She felt the weight of it press against her ribs, squeezing until she could barely breathe. Her conscience took her back to an hour before, when she overheard those voices that still echoed in her mind. She had been folding linen in a back room when two of Mr. Briggs's associates had stopped by the office, their boots tracking slush across the floorboards. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. The door had been left ajar, and their words carried clear as church bells. Briggs has found him, Colorado, just before Christmas. The pile of sheets had slipped from her arms. She caught them before they hit the floor, but her hands trembled so badly she could hardly grip the fabric. Colorado, just before Christmas. Maggie moved away from the window and lowered herself onto the narrow bed that creaked under her weight. The room was small and spare, furnished with only what she needed. A bed, a table, a chair, a washstand. The candle on the table flickered, throwing shadows against the yellowed wallpaper. She pressed her palms to her knees and tried to steady her breathing. Her spectacles had slid down her nose, and she pushed them back up with fingers that felt clumsy and cold. "Oh, Lord," she whispered, "what have I done?" She knew the answer. She had done what her conscience demanded, or what she thought her conscience demanded. She had told the truth when Mr. Briggs had asked about the Mallory theft, that old case he kept going back to like a dog worrying a bone. She had described Joe, the boy she once knew, who had lived next door with his family. A good family, hard-working people who went to church on Sundays and helped their neighbors when times were lean. She had watched Joe grow from a lanky boy into a strong young man. She had seen him carry his mother's casket down the church steps when the pneumonia took her. She had watched him work himself ragged on the docks, trying to keep food on the table for his father and younger brother. And then the accident, that terrible Christmas when it all fell apart. Maggie stood and moved to the table. She pulled out the single drawer and removed a sheet of paper, a pen, and the small bottle of ink she kept for writing letters. Her hands still shook as she unscrewed the cap. She had defended Joe for years after he disappeared. When the police came asking questions, she had told them he left days before the theft. She had lied without hesitation because she believed in him. She believed he was grieving, not guilty. But then the years passed, 7 of them. And with each Christmas, as she lit her candle for his soul, doubt had crept in like cold air under a door. Had she been wrong? Had she protected a thief? Was her loyalty a sin? When Mr. Briggs mentioned the Mallory case again last month, she had felt the weight of those 7 years bearing down on her. She had convinced herself that truth was righteous, that hiding knowledge was the same as lying, that God wanted her to speak. So she spoke. She told Mr. Briggs about Joe, about the scar on his temple from a dock fight, about how his left arm never straightened quite right after it broke. She gave him whatever he needed to find the man who had once been her neighbor. Maggie dipped the pen into the ink and held it over the paper. A drop fell and spread like a tiny stain. She blotted it with the edge of her sleeve. "Dear Joe," she wrote. The letters came out crooked and uncertain. She paused. What could she possibly say? How did you apologize for setting a bounty hunter on someone's trail? How did you explain that you thought you were doing right, only to realize too late that you had done terrible harm? She bent over the page and forced herself to continue. I pray this letter reaches you in time. I pray you can forgive an old woman who thought she was serving truth, but served only her own guilt instead. The words came slowly. She scratched them out one by one, stopping often to wipe her eyes. Her vision blurred, and she had to take off her spectacles to clean them. A man came to the agency where I work. His name is Nate Briggs. He is a bounty hunter, and he asked about the Mallory theft. I told him about you, Joe. I told him everything. I thought I was doing right. I thought truth mattered more than loyalty. But now I hear he has found you, and I realize what I have done." Maggie set down the pen and pressed her hands over her face. The guilt sat in her stomach like a stone. She had betrayed him. There was no other word for it. She had taken the trust of a grieving boy and broken it into pieces. She picked up the pen again. "I remember the night you left. You bumped into me on the street, and there was blood on your sleeve. You said you were going west. You said there was nothing left for you here. I believed you were running from grief, that, not guilt. I still want to believe that. I want to believe the boy I knew was good, even in his darkest hour." She stopped writing and stared at the candle flame. It wavered and steadied, like a heartbeat made of light. Outside, the snow fell heavier. She could hear it tapping against the window like fingernails scratching to get in. She thought of Colorado, that distant place she had never seen. Was the snow falling there too? Was Joe looking out his own window, wondering if his past would ever let him go? "I do not know what you did with that money, Joe. I do not know if you spent it or saved it, or built a good life with it. But I know you were not a bad man. You were a broken one, and I should have remembered that before I spoke." Her hand cramped, and she flexed her fingers. The lye soap she used at work had cracked the skin around her knuckles, and the rough patches caught on the paper as she wrote. "Mr. Briggs will come for you. He is a hard man, but not a cruel one. I have watched him work, and I believe he still has some mercy left in him. Perhaps if he sees the man you have become, he will see what I should have seen all along. That punishment is not always the same as justice." Maggie paused and looked around her small room. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbors moving about. Someone coughed, a door slammed, the ordinary sounds of ordinary lives. She wondered if Joe's life had become ordinary out there in Colorado. She hoped it had. She hoped he had found work and friends and maybe even peace. She hoped he lit candles at Christmas and thought of his mother and father and brother without the weight of guilt crushing him. "I am sorry, Joe. Those words are not enough, but they are all I have. I am sorry I did not trust you. I am sorry I let my own guilt poison my loyalty. I am sorry that my need for a clear conscience has put you in danger." She reached the bottom of the page and turned it over to continue on the back. "If Mr. Briggs takes you east, I will speak for you. I will tell them about your family, about the accident, about how the company threw you away like so much rubbish when you had given them years of honest labor. I will tell them you were not a thief, you were a survivor." Her throat tightened, and she had to stop writing to collect herself. She closed her eyes and said a silent prayer, not for herself, for Joe, that he would be safe, that he would be shown mercy. That somehow this letter would reach him before Mr. Briggs did, though she knew the odds of that were small. The snow outside reminded her of the Christmas Joe disappeared. She had heard the carolers singing that night, their voices carrying through the cold air. She had heard the bells from St. Patrick's ringing across the rooftops. And somewhere in all that music and light, a young man had fled into the darkness with stolen money and a broken heart. Maggie opened her eyes and finished the letter. "I hope Christmas brings you mercy, not chains. I hope you have built a good life out there, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, even though I do not deserve it. Your old neighbor, Maggie Jones." She signed her name carefully and set down the pen. The ink glistened wetly on the page, and she blew on it to help it dry. When it was ready, she folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. Her hands were steadier now. Purpose had replaced panic. She addressed the envelope to Joseph Carter, 3 Pines, Colorado. That was the name Mr. Briggs had mentioned, the name Joe had taken to replace the one he was born with. She wondered if he had chosen it carefully or just picked the first name that came to mind. Maggie put on her coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck. She tucked the letter into her pocket and picked up the candle. The flame bent sideways as she moved, but it did not go out. The post office was 6 blocks away. The snow had turned the streets slippery, and she walked slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight down. Her breath came out in white puffs. The cold bit at her cheeks and made her eyes water. When she reached the post office, she handed the letter to the clerk and paid the postage. He stamped it and tossed it into a bin with dozens of other envelopes. Maggie watched it disappear among the others, one small plea for forgiveness lost in a sea of ordinary mail. She walked home through the snow. The streets were quieter now. Most people had gone inside to escape the cold. She passed a church where light spilled from the windows, and she could hear the faint sound of a choir practicing Christmas hymns. Back in her room, she placed the candle on the table and sat in the chair. She did not light it yet. That would come later, on Christmas Eve, as it did every year. But she stared at it now, at the smooth wax and the blackened wick, and she prayed. She prayed that her letter would arrive in time. She prayed that Mr. Briggs would see Joe's goodness. She prayed that somehow, in some way, the mercy she had failed to show would still find its way west. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall. It blanketed the city in white, covering the dirt and grime and making the world look clean and new. Maggie watched it pile up on the sill and thought of Colorado, where the same storm might be raging. She pictured mountains she had never seen, valleys she would never visit, a ranch where a man named Joseph Carter lived under a borrowed name, waiting for his past to catch up with him. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "let there be mercy." The candle sat silent on the table, waiting, just like she was, just like Joe must be, though he did not know it yet, waiting for Christmas, waiting for judgment, waiting to see if redemption was still possible for those who had sinned and suffered and tried, however imperfectly, to make amends. Chapter 11. The sound of hoofbeats pulled Joe's attention from the fence post he was repairing. He straightened slowly, hammer still in hand, and watched a rider approach from the direction of town. The man sat his horse like someone who had spent years in the saddle, easy but alert. Even from a distance, Joe recognized the long brown duster and the way the man held himself. Nate Briggs. Joe's stomach tightened. He set the hammer down carefully on the fence rail and wiped his hands on his trousers. The cold air bit at his lungs as he drew a slow breath and waited. The rider came closer, his horse's breath making white clouds in the winter air. When he reached the fence line, he stopped and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," Nate said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that never said more than it needed to. "Morning," Joe replied. He kept his tone neutral, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Nate looked past him toward the barn and the cabin beyond. "Nice place you've got here. Heard in town you run a fair operation." "I do my best. That's what folks say. They speak well of you, Mr. Carter." Nate's eyes came back to Joe's face, studying him with the kind of attention that missed nothing. "I'm looking to discuss some cattle trade. Wondered if you might have time for a conversation." Joe knew this was no cattle trade. He could see it in the way Nate watched him, in the careful way he chose his words. But there was nothing to do except play along and see where it led. "I've got time," Joe said. "Come on up to the house. I'll put coffee on." Nate dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. Joe led the way to the cabin, his mind racing. Holly had gone into town for supplies. She would not be back for at least another hour. That was good. Whatever was about to happen, he did not want her caught in the middle of it. Inside, the cabin was warm from the stove. The candle sat on the table where Holly had placed it that morning. Joe filled the coffee pot and set it on the stove, then gestured for Nate to take a seat. Nate settled into the chair and looked around the room. His gaze took in the simple furniture, the clean-swept floor, the Bible on the shelf beside the window. When his eyes landed on the candle, they stayed there for a moment before moving on. Joe poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. His left arm ached in the cold, the way it always did. He wrapped both hands around his cup and waited. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind pushing against the cabin walls. Finally, Nate took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down. "You make good coffee," he said. "Strong, but not bitter." "My mother taught me," Joe said. "She believed if a man was going to do a task, he ought to do it right." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Nate nodded slowly. His eyes went to Joe's hands, resting on either side of the coffee cup. Joe saw him looking at the scar on his temple, barely visible now after all these years. He saw him notice the way Joe's left arm didn't straighten all the way. "You've done well for yourself out here," Nate said. "Built something from nothing, by the sound of it. That takes work." "It does. Takes money, too, I'd imagine. Land don't come free, even out here." Joe's chest tightened, but he kept his face still. "I had some savings, enough to get started." "From dock work?" Nate's voice remained even, but the question hung in the air like smoke. Joe met his eyes and said nothing. Nate leaned back in his chair. "I'm not here about cattle, Mr. Carter. I think you know that." "I figured as much. I'm here because of an old case, a theft that happened 7 years ago back east. Christmas Eve, 1871. A man named Joseph Mallory took money from a shipping company and disappeared." Nate paused. "The company's been looking for him ever since." Joe's hands tightened around his cup. The heat from the coffee burned his palms, but he didn't let go. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your neighbor in New York spoke kindly of you," Nate said. "Maggie Jones. She remembered you, remembered your family. She said you were a good man who'd been through hard times." The name hit Joe like a fist to the gut. Maggie. Sweet, faithful Maggie, who had defended him all these years, and now she had given him up. "She didn't want to tell me," Nate continued. "I could see that. But guilt has a way of weighing on people. She carried yours for 7 years before it got too heavy." Joe's throat felt tight. He set down his cup before his shaking hands gave him away. "What do you want from me?" "The truth, to start with." Joe looked at the table, at the worn wood grain beneath his hands. He thought of Holly, of the life they were trying to build together. He thought of the men who worked for him, who depended on him for wages and a fair shake. He thought of all the good he had tried to do, all the debts he had tried to repay. And he thought of the safe he had opened 7 years ago, of the money he had taken with hands still shaking from rage and grief. "I didn't plan it," he said quietly, "if that matters." Nate said nothing, just waited. "My father and brother died in an accident at the docks. The owner called it regrettable and fired me the same day. Said I was slowing down his operation with my mourning." Joe's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "On Christmas Eve, that day after they died and I was fired, I went to collect our final wages. The safe was open. I saw the money sitting there and I took it. All of it." "How much?" $2,300. Nate's expression didn't change. "And you came west." "I came west. I bought land. I built this ranch, and I still have all the money I took, every dollar of it." Joe finally looked up and met Nate's eyes. "Every day since, I've tried to make up for what I did. I've hired men no one else would hire. I've given cattle to families who needed food. I've donated lumber and money to the church and the school." He stopped and swallowed hard. "I thought maybe if I did enough good, it would balance out the wrong." "Does it?" "No." Joe's voice was barely above a whisper. "It never does." Nate studied him in silence. His steel-colored eyes gave nothing away. He picked up his coffee and took another slow sip. "You have a wife now," Nate said. "Saw her in town. Pretty woman. Looks at you like she believes in you." "She did." Joe felt the weight of those words. "Until she found out the truth." "When was that?" "Last night. She found the old ledgers from the shipping company. I told her everything." Joe's jaw tightened. "She left, walked out into the snow. I didn't know if she was coming back." Nate set down his cup. "But she did come back. She wasn't away for long. Heard her return during the night. When I came into the cabin this morning, she was going about her day like she has every other since she arrived here. She hasn't spoken to me since." "She came back," Nate repeated. "That means something." Joe didn't answer. He didn't know what it meant. Didn't know if Holly had come back because she forgave him or because she had nowhere else to go. The sound of a wagon rattling into the yard broke the silence. Joe's head came up. Through the window, he could see Holly climbing down from the seat, her arms full of parcels from town. Her face was pale, her eyes red. She pushed open the door and stopped when she saw Nate sitting at the table. Her gaze went from him to Joe and back again. "Mrs. Carter," Nate said, rising to his feet. "My name is Nate Briggs." Holly set down the parcels slowly. Her hands trembled. "I know who you are," she said. "I heard your name in town. You're the man looking for information about a thief." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Joe. Her gray-green eyes were full of pain and questions. What's happening here? Joe stood. He knows Holly. He knows everything. The color drained from her face. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Are you taking him? I'm considering it, Nate said. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. The warrant is still active. The law still stands. When? Holly's voice broke on the word. After Christmas. Nate looked at Joe. I'll give you that much. One more Christmas to face your maker and make things right. Joe felt the world tilt beneath him. One more Christmas, and then chains and a cell and a trial that would end with him behind bars or worse. Can I ask you a question? Joe put to the man. Nate nodded. Why wait? Why not take me now? Nate was quiet for a long moment. He looked around the cabin again, at the Bible on the shelf, at the candle on the table, at Holly standing white-faced and shaking by the door. Because I've been doing this work for a long time, he said finally. I've hunted killers and thieves and men who deserved worse than they got. And in all those years, I've learned that the law and justice ain't always the same. He turned his eyes back to Joe. I want to see what kind of man you really are before I decide which one matters more. Holly made a small sound, halfway between a sob and a gasp. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Nate picked up his hat from the table. I'll be staying at the boarding house in town. You know where to find me. He moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Joe. The day after Christmas, Mr. Carter. That's when I'll need your answer. My answer to what? Whether you're coming east with me willingly or whether I have to make you. Joe nodded slowly. I'll be there. I believe you will. Nate settled his hat on his head and opened the door. Cold air rushed into the warm cabin. Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry to have brought trouble to your home. Holly said nothing. She just stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. Nate stepped out into the cold and closed the door behind him. A moment later, they heard his horse's hooves crunching through the snow, growing fainter as he rode away. Joe and Holly stood in the silence he left behind. The fire crackled. The wind moaned around the eaves. The candle burned steadily on the table. Finally, Holly moved. She crossed the room and stood in front of Joe, close enough that he could see the tears on her cheeks. One more Christmas, she whispered. One more Christmas. Joe's voice was rough. Holly, I'm so sorry for all of it, for what I did, for bringing you into this. Stop. She held up her hand. I can't hear all that right now. I can't. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. What are you going to do? I don't know. Pray, I suppose. Try to make peace with what's coming. She nodded slowly. Her face was very pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke again. Then we'll pray together. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it with clear hearts. Joe looked at her, at this woman who had every reason to hate him and every right to walk away. Why did you come back last night? Holly was quiet for a moment. Because I was angry and scared and hurt, she said finally. But somewhere between here and town, I came to a realization. You're not the man who stole that money. Not anymore. That man died somewhere out here in the snow, and someone else grew up in his place. She reached out and touched his scarred hand. I don't know if that's enough to save you from what's coming, but it's enough for me to stand beside you while we find out. Joe's vision blurred. He pulled her close and held her while the wind howled outside and the candle burned low on the table. One more Christmas, one more day to face his maker and make things right. Chapter 12. The wind started just after nightfall. Joe had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard it coming down from the mountains, a low moan that grew louder with each passing moment. He looked up at the sky and saw the clouds rolling in, dark and heavy with snow. Storm's coming, he called to Holly, who was bringing in the last of the washing from the line. She nodded and hurried inside with her arms full of frozen sheets. Joe carried in as much wood as he could and stacked it by the stove. They would need it before the night was through. By the time full dark fell, the wind was howling around the cabin like a living creature trying to get in. Snow drove against the walls in sheets, and the temperature dropped so fast that ice began forming on the inside of the windows. Holly lit the candle and set it on the table. The single flame seemed small and fragile against the fury outside, but it burned steady. Joe barred the door and checked the windows. The house was sealed tight. They had food and water and wood enough for several days if needed. But they were alone. The hired men had gone into town that afternoon and would not make it back until the storm passed. Or so he thought. The knock came an hour later, hard and urgent. Joe grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. "Who's there?" "Briggs." The voice was muffled by the wind. "Let me in before I freeze." Joe glanced at Holly. Her face went pale, but she nodded. He unbarred the door and pulled it open. Snow and wind rushed in along with Nate, who staggered inside and nearly fell to his knees. Joe slammed the door shut and barred it again. Nate stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, iced in snow from head to foot, his brows frosted above his eyes. His face was red from the cold, and his hands shook as he pulled off his gloves. "I tried to make it back to town," he said. "Horse threw a shoe half a mile out. I had to let him go and walk. Your place was closer than the town." Holly moved to the stove and poured hot coffee into a cup. She handed it to Nate without a word. He took it with shaking hands and drank. Joe set the rifle back in its place. "You're lucky you made it. Another hour and you'd have frozen." "I know it." Nate pulled off his coat and hung it by the fire. Water dripped from it onto the floor. "I wasn't planning on spending a night away from lodgings in town, but I guess fate had other ideas." Holly wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "Sit down before you fall down," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. Nate sat in the chair by the fire. Joe remained standing, his back to the wall. The three of them stayed that way for a while, listening to the wind scream outside. The candle burned on the table, casting its shadows long and dark against the walls. Finally, Nate spoke. "I've been thinking about what you told me this morning, Carter, about why you took that money." Joe said nothing. "I've hunted a lot of men over the years. Killers, mostly. Men who hurt folks for no reason other than they liked doing it. Men who left widows and orphans behind without a second thought." Nate stared into his coffee. "You're not like them." "That doesn't change what I did," Joe said. "No, it doesn't, but it matters." Nate looked up at him. "When I first took this case, I thought I was hunting a thief, a man who stole from his employer and ran. Simple as that. But Maggie Jones said something when she told me about you. She said you were a good man who'd been through hard times. I didn't believe her then. Thought she was just being soft because she knew your family." Holly sat down at the table near the candle. She folded her hands in her lap and listened. "But then I came here," Nate continued. "I talked to folks in town. The preacher told me you donated beef every month to families that couldn't afford it. The school teacher said you paid for new books out of your own pocket. The widow Patterson said you fixed her roof last spring and wouldn't take a cent for it." He shook his head slowly. "That's not the behavior of a common thief." "I was trying to make up for what I did," Joe said. His voice was rough. "I thought if I did enough good, it would balance out the bad. But it doesn't work that way. You can't buy forgiveness." "No," Nate agreed. "You can't." The wind rattled the windows. Snow hissed against the glass like sand. Joe moved away from the wall and sat down across from Nate. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor between his boots. "I told myself I had a right to that money. The company killed my father and brother through their carelessness. They worked for years in that warehouse, breaking their backs to make that owner rich. And when they died, he threw me out like I was nothing, like they were nothing." He looked up, and his eyes were hard. "So when I saw that safe open, I thought it was justice. I thought I was taking what was owed to me and my family. But that was a lie I told myself to make the stealing easier." Holly reached across the table and touched his hand. He turned it over and gripped her fingers. "The truth is, I was a coward," Joe said. The words came out flat and heavy. "I was scared and hurting and angry, and I took that money because it was there and because I didn't know what else to do. And then I ran. I ran all the way out here, and I built this ranch, and I tried to become someone different, someone better." He swallowed hard. "But you can't outrun what you've done. It follows you like a shadow." Nate was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. The candle flame wavered. "I shot a man once," Nate said finally. "Back when I was with the Pinkertons. We were chasing a gang that had robbed a train. Got a tip they were holed up in a farmhouse outside Pittsburgh. We surrounded the place at dawn and called for them to come out. When they didn't, we went in." He paused and stared into the fire. There was a boy inside, couldn't have been more than 16. He came running down the stairs with a gun in his hand, and I shot him. Killed him before he even got a chance to fire. Found out later he wasn't part of the gang at all. He was the farmer's son, and he thought we were more robbers come to hurt his family. Holly's hand went to her mouth. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my fault, Nate continued, that I was just doing my job, that anyone would have done the same in that situation. But the truth is, I killed an innocent boy because I was scared and because I didn't wait to see who I was shooting at. He looked at Joe. I left the Pinkertons after that. Couldn't stomach the work anymore. Started hunting bounties instead. Figured if I was going to carry a gun, I might as well use it on men who deserved it. Did it help? Joe asked. No. Nate's voice was bitter. It never helps. You just add more weight to what you're already carrying. The three sat in silence. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the cabin was warm, but the air felt heavy with old guilt and unspoken regrets. Holly stood and moved to the shelf where Joe kept his Bible. She took it down and brought it back to the table. The leather cover was worn smooth from use. My father used to read to us every night, she said, especially when we were scared or troubled. He said Scripture had a way of speaking to whatever burden you were carrying. She opened the book and turned the pages until she found what she was looking for. From the Psalms, she said, and began to read. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Her voice was soft but clear. When she finished, she closed the book and set it on the table beside the candle. I've been angry with you, Joe, she said. I've been hurt and scared, and I didn't know if I could forgive what you did. But sitting here, listening to both of you, I realized something. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Your good works weren't lies. They were repentant. Every act of kindness, every dollar given, every hour of honest labor. You weren't trying to hide what you did. You were trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness. Joe's throat tightened. But it doesn't erase what I took. No, Holly agreed. It doesn't. But it matters. It has to matter. Otherwise, there's no point in trying to be better. Nate leaned forward. She's right, Carter. I've hunted men worse for less. Men who killed for pleasure or stole from the helpless without a second thought. You took money from a company that killed your family and cast you aside. That doesn't make it right, but it makes you different from the men I usually chase. So, what are you saying? Joe asked. I'm saying I don't know. Nate rubbed his face with both hands. The law says you're guilty. The warrant says I should take you back east to stand trial. But justice, he trailed off and shook his head. Justice is a harder question. The wind howled louder, shaking the walls. Snow piled up against the door. Holly stood and moved to the stove. She filled the coffee pot and set it to heat. We should pray, she said. All of us, for guidance. Joe looked at her in surprise. You want to pray with him, after everything? Yes. Holly's voice was firm. Because we're all sinners sitting in this cabin tonight, and we all need mercy more than we need judgment. Nate shifted in his chair. I'm not much for praying, Mrs. Carter. Then listen, she said. That's prayer enough. She came back to the table and sat down. Joe reached for her hand on one side. After a moment's hesitation, Nate reached out and took her other hand. The three of them formed a circle around the candle. Holly bowed her head. Lord, we come before you tonight as people who have done wrong and been wronged. We carry burdens we can't put down on our own. We ask for your wisdom and your mercy. Show us the path forward. Help us choose what is right over what is easy. And give us the courage to face tomorrow, whatever it may bring. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen, Joe whispered. Nate said nothing, but he didn't let go of Holly's hand. They sat that way for a while. All three joined together in the candlelight while the storm raged outside. The fire burned low, and Joe got up to add more wood. The coffee boiled, and Holly poured fresh cups for all of them. Nate pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. Storm's getting worse. We'll be here till morning at least. Looks that way, Joe agreed. Good thing you've got a warm cabin and hot coffee. And a candle to see by, Holly added softly. They all looked at the flame burning steady on the table. Outside, the snow thickened and fell heavier. The wind screamed like a wild and desperate creature. But inside the cabin, 3 people sat together in the warmth and waited for Christmas morning to come. Chapter 13. The wind died sometime before dawn. Joe woke to the sound of silence. After hours of listening to the storm scream around the cabin, the quiet felt strange and almost heavy. He lay on his bedroll near the fire and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows dance across the wooden beams. Nate was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back and his mouth slightly open. Holly had taken the bed hours ago when exhaustion finally overcame her fear. The candle had burned down to a stub but still flickered on the table, casting its small circle of light. Joe sat up slowly, careful not to make a noise. His left arm ached from lying on the hard floor, and his back was stiff. He moved to the window and looked out. The world was white and still. Snow covered the ground in thick drifts that sparkled in the pale light of early morning. The sky was clear, washed clean by the storm. In the east, the first hint of sunrise touched the horizon with pink and gold. Christmas morning. Joe pressed his forehead against the cold glass. This was supposed to be the day he faced his maker and made things right. But what did that mean? What could he possibly do to balance the scales after 7 years? Behind him, Nate stirred and cleared his throat. Joe turned and saw the bounty hunter sitting up straighter, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "Storm's over," Joe said quietly. Nate nodded. He stood and walked to the window, standing beside Joe to look out at the snow. Neither man spoke for a long moment. Finally, Nate said, "I need to head back to town. Check on my horse, see if he made it through the night." "And after that?" Joe's voice was steady, but his heart hammered in his chest. "After that, we'll see." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. Joe could feel the weight of everything unsaid, all the decisions that hung in the balance. Holly appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. She had dressed, but her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face was pale. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," both men replied. She moved to the stove and began preparing coffee. Her hands shook slightly as she measured out the grounds, but she said nothing. The 3 of them waited in the quiet cabin while the coffee boiled and the light grew stronger outside. When the coffee was ready, Holly poured 3 cups and brought them to the table. They sat in the same places they had occupied the night before, around the candle that still burned. Joe wrapped his hands around his cup and gathered his courage. "Before you leave, Mr. Briggs, there's something I need to give you." Nate looked at him over the rim of his cup. Joe stood and went to the desk in the corner. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he carried it back to the table and set it in front of Nate. "What's this?" Nate asked. "A bank draft." Joe's voice was rough. "It's for $23,000, 10 times what I stole. I want you to take it back east and give it to the widow of the man who owned that shipping company. Tell her it's payment for what was taken, plus interest for the years it's been gone." Holly's hand flew to her mouth. "Joe, that's everything. That's all the money from the ranch sale, and the cattle, and the savings. That's our whole future." "I know." Joe looked at her with steady eyes. "But it was never really ours to begin with. It was built on money that didn't belong to me. I can't keep it and call myself an honest man." Nate picked up the bank draft and unfolded it. He stared at the amount written there, then looked up at Joe with an expression that was hard to read. "This is a lot of money, Carter. It's what's right." Joe's jaw tightened. "I can't undo what I did 7 years ago. I can't bring back the time I stole or the trust I broke, but I can pay back what was taken, with interest. And maybe that's a start." "A start toward what?" Nate asked. "Toward being the man I should have been all along." Nate set the bank draft on the table and leaned back in his chair. He studied Joe's face for a long time, his steel-colored eyes revealing nothing. The candle flame wavered between them. "You know what this means," Nate said finally. "If I take this money and you come back east with me, you'll have nothing left. No ranch, no savings, no future out here. You'll stand trial, and even if they show mercy, you'll likely spend years in prison. You'll lose everything." "I know," Joe said. "And you're willing to do that?" "I am." Holly made a small sound, halfway between a sob and a gasp. Tears streamed down her face. Joe, please, there has to be another way. He reached across the table and took her hand. There isn't, Holly. Not if I want to live with myself. Not if I want to be worthy of you. You already are, she whispered. You've been trying to make up for what you did for 7 years. Doesn't that count for anything? It does, Nate said quietly. Both of them looked at him in surprise. He picked up the bank draft again and held it up to the light from the window. It counts for more than you know, Mrs. Carter. He stood and walked to the stove. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the paper in his hand. Then he did something that neither Joe nor Holly expected. He tore the warrant in half. The sound of ripping paper was loud in the quiet cabin. Nate tore it again and again until the warrant was rendered to confetti. He opened the stove door and threw the shredded paper into the fire. They caught immediately, curling and blackening as the flames consumed them. Joe stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. What are you doing? Nate turned to face him. His expression was calm, but his eyes held what might have been relief. Mallory died years ago, he said. Carter lives here now. But the law says a man who steals must pay for his crime. You just tried to pay 10 times over. Nate gestured to the bank draft still lying on the table. As far as I'm concerned, justice has been served. More than served. Holly burst into tears. She covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs. Joe stared at Nate, unable to speak. His throat had closed up, and his eyes burned. He felt like his legs might give out beneath him. I don't understand, he finally managed to say. You came all this way. You have a job to do. I did have a job. Nate moved back to the table and picked up the bank draft. He held it out to Joe. But somewhere between town and here, I remembered why I left the Pinkertons in the first place. I was tired of enforcing rules that didn't always serve justice. This is one of those times. Joe took the bank draft with shaking hands. So, you're just letting me go? I'm saying Joseph Mallory no longer exists. He died on that dock 7 years ago, along with his father and brother. The man standing in front of me is Joseph Carter, an honest rancher who employs good men, helps his neighbors, and tries to do right by the world. Nate's voice was firm. That's the man I see. That's the man I'll remember when I go back east and tell them the trail went cold. Joe sank to his knees. The bank draft fell from his hands and fluttered to the floor. He pressed his palms against his face, and his whole body shook. Holly rushed to him and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. She held him while he wept, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, where he had locked away 7 years of guilt and fear and desperate hope for redemption. Nate stood watching them, his face grave but peaceful. After a moment, he moved to the table and looked at the candle. It was nearly burned down, just a small stub left, but the flame still burned steady and bright. He reached out and adjusted the candle slightly, making sure it would not tip over as it finished burning. The flame responded to the movement, bending and then straightening again. Light spilled across the table and touched the faces of the 2 people kneeling on the floor. I should go, Nate said quietly. Joe looked up at him. His face was wet with tears and his eyes were red, but there was something different in his expression, something lighter. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how to thank you enough. Live an honest life, Nate said. Be good to your wife. Help your neighbors. That's thanks enough. He put on his coat and hat and moved toward the door. Holly stood and followed him, wiping her own tears away. Mr. Briggs, she said, will you stay for breakfast? It's Christmas morning. You shouldn't ride back to town on an empty stomach. Nate smiled slightly. It was the first time either of them had seen him smile. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, but I should get going. I've got a long ride ahead of me if I'm going to make it back east before New Year's. He opened the door, and cold air rushed in. The morning sun was higher now, turning the snow brilliant white. Somewhere in the distance, unheard by them, a church bell began to ring, calling people to Christmas service. Nate stepped out onto the porch and then turned back. Merry Christmas, Joe, he said softly. Joe had gotten to his feet. He stood beside Holly, one arm around her waist, holding her close. Merry Christmas, Mr. Briggs. Nate touched the brim of his hat to Holly, then walked down the steps and into the snow. They watched him trudge toward town, his long duster flapping behind him. He grew smaller and smaller until he was just a dark figure against the white landscape. Joe closed the door and leaned against it. He looked at Holly and saw tears still streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "We're free," she whispered. "We're really free." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. Over her shoulder, he could see the candle still burning on the table. The flame was small now, flickering as it reached the end of its wick. But it burned steadily and warm, casting its light across the room. In town, the church bells continued to ring. The sun climbed higher in the clear Christmas sky. And in the little cabin on the Colorado ranch, two people stood together and felt the weight of 7 years finally lift from their shoulders. Chapter 14. The afternoon sun hung low in the winter sky, turning the snow-covered landscape gold and orange. Joe stood in the barn, feeding the horses while Holly worked in the cabin, preparing a simple Christmas dinner from what supplies they had. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and bright. They had not spoken much since Nate left that morning. There seemed to be no words big enough to hold what had happened. Joe kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream, that Nate was still there with the warrant in his hand, ready to take him back east. But it was real. The relief was real. The freedom was real. He was forking hay into the stalls when he heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. His heart jumped into his throat. Had Nate changed his mind? Had he come back to finish what he started? Joe walked to the barn door and looked out. A rider was coming up the road from town, but it was not Nate. This man wore the uniform of a postal rider, and he had a leather satchel slung across his chest. Joe stepped out into the yard and waited. The rider pulled up his horse and tipped his hat. "Mr. Carter? That's right. Got a letter for you. Came in on the train yesterday, but I couldn't get out here until the roads cleared." The rider reached into his satchel and pulled out an envelope. "Sign here, please." Joe signed the paper the rider held out, then took the envelope. His hands were still stiff from the cold, and he fumbled with them slightly. "Merry Christmas," the rider said, then turned his horse and headed back toward town. Joe looked down at the envelope. The return address was from New York. His stomach tightened. He walked slowly back to the cabin, turning the letter over in his hands. Holly looked up from the stove when he came in. "Who was that? Post rider?" Joe held up the envelope. "Brought a letter. It's from New York." Holly's face went pale. She set down the spoon she was holding and wiped her hands on her apron. "From New York?" Joe nodded. He moved to the table and sat down. His fingers shook as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Round and slightly crooked, the letters formed by hands that had scrubbed too many floors and washed too many linens. "It's from Maggie," he said quietly. Holly came and stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder. "What does it say?" Joe's eyes scanned the first few lines, and his throat tightened. He tried to read aloud, but his voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Dear Joe," he began, "I pray this letter reaches you in time. I pray you can forgive an old woman who thought she was serving truth but served only her own guilt instead." He paused and swallowed hard. Holly's hands squeezed his shoulder. "A man came to the agency where I work," Joe continued reading. "His name is Nate Briggs. He is a bounty hunter, and he asked about the Mallory theft. I told him about you, Joe. I told him everything." Holly's breath caught. "I thought I was doing right," Joe read on. "I thought truth mattered more than loyalty. But now I hear he has found you, and I realize what I have done. I remember the night you left. You bumped into me on the street and there was blood on your sleeve. You said you were going west. You said there was nothing left for you here. I believed you were running from grief, not guilt. I still want to believe that." Joe's voice grew rougher with each word. "I do not know what you did with that money, Joe. I do not know if you spent it or saved it or built a good life with it. But I know you were not a bad man. You were a broken one, and I should have remembered that before I spoke." He had to stop and wipe his eyes. Holly leaned down and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his head. "Mr. Briggs will come for you," Joe continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "He is a hard man, but not a cruel one. I have watched him work, and I believe he still has some mercy left in him. Perhaps if he sees the man you have become, he will see what I should have seen all along." that punishment is not always the same as justice. Joe turned the page over. There was more writing on the back. I am sorry, Joe. Those words are not enough, but they are all I have. I am sorry I did not trust you. I am sorry I let my own guilt poison my loyalty. I am sorry that my need for a clear conscience has put yours in danger. If Mr. Briggs takes you east, I will speak for you. I will tell them about your family, about the accident, about how the company threw you away like so much rubbish when you had given them years of honest labor. His voice broke completely. He set the letter down on the table and pressed his palms against his eyes. Holly came around and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. After a moment, Joe picked up the letter again and read the final lines. I hope Christmas brings you mercy, not chains. I hope you have built a good life out there, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me, even though I do not deserve it. Your old neighbor, Maggie Jones. Silence filled the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up again, sending little swirls of snow across the yard. The sun was sinking lower, painting the windows with red and gold light. Holly looked up at Joe with tears streaming down her face. She was trying to warn you. She sent this to save you. Joe nodded slowly. She thought she had destroyed me. She spent all this time defending me, and then her conscience made her speak, and it nearly cost me everything. But it didn't, Holly said firmly. Joe, don't you see? Her letter came too late to warn you, but it arrived just in time to show you something else. What? That even her mistake was part of the bigger plan. Holly's voice was gentle but sure. If she hadn't told Mr. Briggs about you, he never would have come here. And if he hadn't come here, you never would have had the chance to face what you did. You never would have offered to pay back the money. You never would have received the mercy he showed you this morning. Joe stared at her. The truth of her words settled over him like a warm blanket. She thought she was condemning you, Holly continued, but instead she set in motion the very circumstances that saved you, not just from the law, but from the guilt you've been carrying for 7 years. Joe looked down at the letter again. Maggie's crooked handwriting blurred through his tears. She had defended him for so long, and then her faith had told her to speak the truth. And that truth, as painful as it was, had led to his freedom. He stood and went to the desk. He pulled out a sheet of paper and dipped his pen in the ink. What are you doing? Holly asked. Writing back to her. Joe's hand moved across the page. She needs to know what happened. She needs to know that her mistake wasn't a mistake at all. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. Dear Maggie, your letter arrived this afternoon. Mr. Briggs came, just as you said he would. He found me, and he knew the truth. But he also saw what you saw all those years ago, that I was not a bad man, just a broken one. This morning, on Christmas Day, he tore up the warrant and told me that Joseph Mallory died 7 years ago. Joseph Carter lives here now. Joe paused and looked at Holly. She nodded encouragement. You thought you betrayed me, he wrote, but you saved me. You forced the truth into the light, and in that light, I found mercy. I found forgiveness. I found a way to finally be free of the guilt I've carried since that Christmas Eve so long ago. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for caring enough to defend me for 7 years. Thank you for caring enough to speak the truth when your conscience demanded it. And thank you for sending a warning that reminded me I was never alone, even when I thought I was. He signed the letter and folded it carefully. Then he stood and carried it to the table where the candle had burned down that morning. A fresh candle sat there now, unlit. Holly had placed it there after they cleaned up from breakfast. Joe looked at the candle, then at the letter in his hand, then at Holly. Light it, Holly said softly. Joe struck a match and touched it to the wick. The flame caught and grew, casting its warm glow across the table. He set Maggie's letter beside the candle, and Holly placed his reply next to it. We should seal it, Holly said. Seal the past under the candle, like we're putting it to rest. Joe understood. He picked up both letters and held them together. Holly lifted the candle and tilted it slightly. Hot wax dripped onto the papers, falling in slow white drops that hardened as they cooled. They watched as the wax covered the edges of both letters, binding them together. When enough wax had dripped, Joe set the letters back on the table. They sat there sealed together, Maggie's confession and Joe's forgiveness joined under a layer of hardened wax. Holly replaced the candle in its holder. The flame burned steady and bright. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of church bells. Joe and Holly both turned toward the window. The bells rang clear and pure through the cold air, calling the faithful to evening service, even though it was impossible that they could be heard so far from town. "They're ringing for Christmas," Holly said. "They're ringing for hope," Joe replied. He put his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "For new beginnings." They stood together at the window, watching the last light of Christmas Day fade from the sky. The candle burned behind them, its light reflecting in the glass. Outside, the world was white and clean and silent, except for the distant bells. Joe thought of Maggie in her small room in New York, lighting her own candle and praying for his soul. He thought of Nate riding east with the lie that would save him. He thought of Holly standing beside him, choosing forgiveness over judgment. And he thought of his father and brother, buried all those years ago in frozen ground. He hoped they could see him now. He hoped they knew that their deaths had not been in vain, that the money taken in their name had been offered back, that the man who fled in grief and rage had found his way to something like redemption. "We should get ready for service," Holly said quietly. "If the roads are clear enough to travel." Joe nodded. "I'd like that. I'd like to give thanks properly." They moved away from the window and began preparing to go into town. Joe put on his good coat and Holly wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Before they left, they both paused at the table and looked at the candle burning beside the sealed letters. "Merry Christmas, Maggie," Joe whispered. Holly took his hand and squeezed it. Then they stepped out into the cold evening air, leaving the candle burning in the window behind them. Its light would shine through the darkness, a beacon of hope for lost souls finding their way home. Chapter 15. 6 weeks had passed since Christmas morning. The winter snow had begun to melt, leaving patches of brown earth visible across the valley. Ice still clung to the edges of the creek, but the worst of the cold had passed. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. Joe stood at the mirror in the cabin, adjusting his collar for the third time. His hands shook slightly. Holly came up behind him and reached around to straighten his tie. "You look fine," she said softly. "I feel like I can't breathe." "That's just nerves. Every man feels that way on his wedding day." Joe turned to face her. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, the best one she owned. Her auburn hair was pinned up neatly, and her gray-green eyes shone with happiness. She looked beautiful. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Are you sure you want to renew our vows and marry a man with my past again?" Holly reached up and touched his scarred temple gently. "I'm sure I want to marry the man you are now, not the man you were. There's a difference. I want to take my vows before God now that I know you as a man. I didn't know you when we were married in church, and I want to do it over again now, please." "But people will talk. They'll wonder why we married without a congregation, only to want to do it all again now. They'll have questions. Let them wonder. Let them talk. None of that matters." She took his hands in hers. "What matters is that we're building something honest together, something real. That's all the answer anyone needs." A knock at the door interrupted them. Joe opened it to find young Tommy standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Wagon's ready, Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, whenever you're set to go." "Thank you, Tommy. We'll be right out." The man nodded and headed back to the wagon. Joe took a deep breath and looked around the cabin one more time. Everything was in order. The fire was banked. The candle sat ready on the table for when they returned. "Ready?" Holly asked. "Ready." They climbed into the wagon and rode toward town. The road was muddy in places where the snow had melted, but the horses managed well enough. As they drew closer to Three Pines, Joe could see the small white church at the edge of town. People were already gathering outside. "Looks like half the town showed up," Holly observed. "Word gets around fast in a place like this." They pulled up in front of the church, and Samuel helped Holly down from the wagon. Joe tied the horses and stood for a moment, looking at the building. The last time he had been here was Christmas Day, giving thanks for his freedom. Now he was returning to make a covenant before God and these people. Again. Only this time, he was marrying a woman he knew and loved. When he had stood before the altar the last time, he was marrying a stranger he was yet to grow to love. The church doors stood open. Inside, wooden pews lined either side of a narrow aisle. The altar at the front was simple, just a plain wooden table with a cross mounted on the wall behind it. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. People filled the pews. Joe recognized most of them. The general store owner and his wife, the blacksmith, several ranchers from neighboring spreads, the widow Patterson who sat in the front row with tears already streaming down her face, the school teacher, the marshal. They had come to witness Joseph Carter marrying Holly Carter, née Bennett. Two people starting fresh in Colorado, building a life on honest ground. The preacher stood at the front, his Bible open in his hands. He was an older man with white hair and kind eyes. He had been the one to accept Joe's donations of beef and lumber over the years, never asking questions about where the money came from. Joe and Holly walked down the aisle together. There was no one to give her away, no family to stand up with them. They had only each other and the community they had built through years of quiet service. After they reached the front, Joe glanced back at the gathered crowd. His breath caught in his throat. At the very back of the church, standing in the shadows by the door, was Nate Briggs. The bounty hunter met his eyes and gave a slight nod. Then he touched his fingers to the brim of his hat in a quiet salute. Joe's vision blurred. He nodded back, unable to speak. Holly saw the exchange and squeezed his hand. She had seen Nate too. The preacher cleared his throat and began. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Again, his voice carried through the small church, warm and steady. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly. It is a bond that reflects the love of Christ for his church. Joe tried to focus on the words, but his mind kept drifting. He thought of the long road that had brought him here, the pain of loss, the weight of guilt, the years of trying to earn back what could never truly be repaid. And finally, the mercy that had set him free. If any person here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined, the preacher continued, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence filled the church. Joe held his breath, half expecting someone to stand and point out that he was a thief, a fugitive, a man with a false name. But no one spoke. The preacher smiled. Then let us continue. Joseph, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness or in health, until death do you part? I do. Joe's voice was rough but clear. And Holly, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Prosody, Holly's voice rang out, strong and sure. The rings? Joe pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. He had bought it in town the week before, spending money he had earned from selling cattle. Honest money, clean money. He slipped one onto Holly's finger, his hands shaking. She surprised him by doing the same for him, her touch gentle and steady as she eased her father's wedding band onto the finger of the man she loved. The preacher raised his hands over them. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again, Joseph, you may kiss your bride. Joe turned to Holly and cupped her face in his hands. He kissed her softly, tasting salt from her tears. Or maybe they were his tears. He could not tell. The congregation erupted in applause. People stood and clapped and called out their congratulations. The widow Patterson was openly weeping. The school teacher dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Joe and Holly turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, an opportunity they had not had at their first wedding ceremony, which had only 2 attendants besides the reverend. They walked back down the aisle together, and people reached out to touch their shoulders, to shake Joe's hand, to embrace Holly. When they reached the back of the church, Joe looked for Nate, but the bounty hunter was gone. The space where he had stood was empty. Joe stepped outside and scanned the area. He caught a glimpse of a figure on horseback riding away toward the edge of town, the long brown duster, the deliberate way he sat his horse. Nate. Joe started forward, but Holly caught his arm. Let him go. she said quietly. "I need to thank him. You already have, and he knows it." Joe watched until the rider disappeared around a bend in the road. Then he turned back to Holly and pulled her close. "Thank you," he whispered, "for believing in me, for staying, for making me honest." "We made each other honest," Holly replied. She rested her head against his chest. "That's what love does." People spilled out of the church around them, laughing and talking. Someone had brought a fiddle and started playing a cheerful tune. The celebration was beginning, but Joe stood apart from it all for a moment, holding his wife and thinking of the man who had ridden away. Nate Briggs had come to Colorado to bring a criminal to justice. Instead, he had given that man a second chance at life. He had chosen mercy over law, grace over punishment. Joe hoped someday he would see Nate again. He hoped he would have the chance to tell him what that mercy had meant, how it had changed everything. For now, all he could do was live the life Nate had given him. Live it honestly, faithfully, and well. "Come on," Holly said, tugging his hand. "They're waiting for us." They joined the celebration. People brought food and drink. The fiddle player was joined by a man with a harmonica, and soon couples were dancing in the street outside the church. Children ran between the adults, laughing and playing. As the sun began to set, Joe and Holly climbed back into their wagon. People lined the street to wave them off, calling out blessings and good wishes. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. They held hands and watched the sky turn from gold to pink to purple as the sun sank behind the mountains. When they reached the cabin, Joe helped Holly down, and they stood together in the yard, looking at their home. It was small and simple, but it was theirs, built on honest labor and true repentance. "Wait here," Joe said. He went inside and lit the candle on the table. Its warm glow filled the window, visible from outside. He came back and stood beside Holly. Together they watched the candle burn. "I want to continue to do this every Christmas Eve from now on," Holly said. "Light a candle in the window." "To guide lost souls home?" Joe asked, remembering what he had told her when she first arrived. "To remember that we were lost once too, and that we found our way back through mercy and grace." Joe pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "I'll light it every year, I promise." They went inside together and Joe closed the door. The candle continued to burn on the table, casting its light across the room. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Their marriage was beginning in its truest sense. Not with riches or grand celebrations, not with a perfect past or an easy future, but with peace, with honesty, with the knowledge that they had both been forgiven and given a chance to start again. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Chapter 16. 1 year later, Christmas Eve arrived with the first snowfall of winter. Holly stood at the kitchen counter, her hands deep in bread dough. She kneaded it with slow, careful movements, mindful of the growing weight in her belly. 6 months along now, and the baby moved often, reminding her constantly of the new life she carried. Outside, Joe worked in the barn. She could see him through the window, his breath making white clouds in the cold air. He was building something, had been for the past week. Every evening after supper, he disappeared to the barn with his tools and returned late, sawdust clinging to his clothes. She smiled. She knew what he was making, a cradle. Their child would sleep in something made by his father's hands, honest work done with love. The bread dough was soft and smooth under her fingers. She shaped it into loaves and set them aside to rise. The smell of yeast filled the cabin, warm and homey. On the stove, a pot of soup simmered, sending up steam that fogged the windows. Christmas had come around again. A full year since Nate had torn up the warrant. A full year since Joe had been set free from the chains of his past. So much had changed in that year. The cabin door opened, and Joe stamped his boots on the porch before coming inside. He carried a wooden cradle in his arms, beautifully crafted with smooth sides and curved rockers. He had carved simple flowers into the headboard. "It's finished," he said, setting it down gently near the fireplace. Holly wiped her hands on her apron and came to look. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into every cut and curve. "It's beautiful, Joe. I wanted it done before Christmas. Wanted our baby to have something made special." He knelt beside the cradle and rocked it gently. It moved smoothly without a sound. Figured we've got a few more months before we need it, but I wanted it ready." Holly placed her hand on his shoulder. "You did good work." Joe looked up at her, and she saw peace in his eyes. Real peace, the kind that came from a clear conscience. "I've been thinking," he said, "about tomorrow." "What about it?" "I want us to take food to some of the families in town. The ones who are struggling. The widow Patterson, the Johnsons with all those children, the old man who lives alone on the edge of town." "We will always do that, like we did last year," Holly said. "Every year that we are married." "I know, but this year feels different." Joe stood and put his arms around her, careful of her belly. "This year, it's not about paying back what I took. It's about giving because we can, because we want to, because it's right." Holly understood what he meant. For years, Joe's generosity had been driven by guilt. Every gift, every donation, every act of kindness had been an attempt to balance the scales. But this year was different. This year, the giving came from a different place. "The ranch is doing well," Joe continued, "better than it has been in years. All honest profit. No tainted money. No stolen foundation. Just hard work and fair dealing." He pulled back and looked at her. "I figured it out the other day. Over the past year, between what we've earned and what we've given away, we've more than replaced the money I took. Maybe not to the exact dollar, but close enough." "The stolen money is long repaid," Holly said softly. "Through labor and giving and living right." "Through grace," Joe corrected. "Through mercy I didn't deserve but received anyway." They stood together in the warm cabin, listening to the fire crackle and the wind beginning to pick up outside. The first real storm of winter was coming. Holly could feel it in the air. "There's more, though," she said. She moved to the desk and pulled out an envelope. "This came in the mail yesterday. It's from New York." Joe's face went still. "From Maggie?" "It's addressed to both of us, but the handwriting is different, younger." Joe took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in neat, precise writing. He read aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, my name is Ruth Harper. I am writing to you about Maggie Jones, who was my neighbor and friend. I am sorry to tell you that Maggie passed away 2 weeks ago. She went peacefully in her sleep." Joe's voice caught. Holly took his hand and squeezed. He cleared his throat and continued. "Before she died, Maggie asked me to write to you if anything happened to her. She wanted you to know that she received your letter and that it brought her great comfort. She kept it with her always. She also wanted me to send you this." Joe unfolded a second sheet of paper that had been tucked inside the first. It was in Maggie's crooked handwriting, shaky but still readable. "Dear Joe and Holly, by the time you read this, I will have gone to meet my Maker. I am not afraid. I have made my peace with the Lord and with myself. Your letter told me that my mistake led to your freedom. I cannot tell you what that knowledge has meant to me. For months I carried the weight of thinking I had destroyed you, but instead the Lord used my confession to bring about your redemption. There is such beauty in that, such grace. I am so glad you found happiness, Joe. I am so glad you found love. And I am overjoyed to know that you will be parents. May your children grow up knowing both mercy and justice. May they understand that we are all broken and we are all capable of redemption. Tell your babies about their father's journey. Tell them about the man who fled in grief and found his way to grace. Tell them about Christmas and candles and second chances. Bless you both, your old neighbor and friend, Maggie Jones." Joe folded the letter carefully and held it against his chest. Tears streamed down his face, but he was smiling. "She found peace," he whispered. "She died knowing that everything worked out for good." Holly wiped her own eyes. "She's part of our story, Joe. We should tell our child about her, about the woman who defended you and then spoke the truth and then found forgiveness." "We will," Joe promised. "We'll tell our children everything." He moved to the table where the candle sat waiting. It was the same candle holder they had used on their first Christmas together. The candle itself was new, unlit, ready for tonight. "It's getting dark," Holly said. "Should we light it now?" Joe picked up the candle and held it for a moment. "This candle used to be for lost souls," he said quietly, "for people trying to find their way home. But I don't think that's what it's for anymore. What's it for now? For found souls, for people who were lost but aren't anymore, for redemption and grace and second chances. He looked at her. For us. Holly nodded. For us. Joe struck a match and touched it to the wick. The flame caught and grew, casting its warm glow across the table. He set the candle in the window, where its light could be seen from outside. As if on cue, the first snowflakes began to fall. They drifted past the window, soft and white and gentle. Holly watched them accumulate on the sill, covering everything in a clean blanket of white. "Look at that," Joe said. "Right on time." They stood together at the window, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew. Outside, the snow fell steadily, transforming the world. The barn became a white shape in the darkness. The fences disappeared under drifts. The road to town vanished. Everything was being covered. Everything was being made new. "I've been thinking about names," Holly said. "If it's a girl, I'd like to call her Grace, and if it's a boy, maybe Mallory. After the name your father gave you, carried forward into a new generation." Joe's arm tightened around her. "Grace Carter or Mallory Joseph Carter?" He laughed softly. "Both sound right to me." The candle burned steady in the window, its light reflected off the falling snow, making it sparkle and dance. Inside the cabin, everything was warm and peaceful, the bread rising on the counter, the soup simmering on the stove, the cradle waiting by the fireplace. Two people standing together, watching winter arrive. "Do you ever think about that Christmas?" Holly asked quietly. "The one 8 years ago when you took the money?" "Sometimes," Joe admitted, "but not like I used to. It doesn't haunt me anymore. It's just part of my story now, a dark chapter that led to better ones." "Do you ever regret coming west?" "Never. If I hadn't run, I never would have found this place. I never would have found you. I never would have learned what real redemption feels like." He turned to face her fully. "I can't be glad I stole that money. I can't be glad my father and brother died, but I can be grateful for where the journey led me. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Holly said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "God works in mysterious ways. He takes our worst moments and uses them for good. Your theft led to this ranch. Your guilt led to generosity. Maggie's confession led to Nate finding you, and Nate finding you led to freedom. It's all connected." "Like a circle," Joe said, "starting in pain and ending in peace." They watched the snow fall for a long time, neither speaking. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. The fire crackled and popped. The candle flame never wavered. Finally, Joe stirred. "We should load up the wagon tomorrow morning. Get that food to the families before the roads get too bad." "We will," Holly agreed. "First task of the day. And then church?" "And then church," Joe smiled. "And then home to celebrate our second Christmas as husband and wife, and our last Christmas before we become parents." "Our last quiet Christmas," Holly corrected with a laugh. "Next year there'll be a little Mallory or Grace crying and needing attention." "I can't wait," Joe said simply. They moved away from the window and began preparing for bed. Joe banked the fire and checked the doors. Holly covered the bread dough with a cloth and set the table for tomorrow's breakfast. They moved through these evening rituals with the easy comfort of two people who knew each other well and loved each other deeply. Before climbing into bed, Joe took one more look at the candle in the window. It burned bright and steady, a beacon of hope visible through the falling snow. Anyone traveling past on this Christmas Eve would see that light and know that someone was home. Someone was waiting, someone cared, but more than that, the candle was a reminder, a symbol of a soul that had been lost in darkness and found its way back to the light, a symbol of redemption earned through honesty, granted through mercy, and sealed with love. Joe turned away from the window and joined Holly in bed. She nestled against him, her back to his chest, his hand resting gently on her belly where their child slept. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the candle continued to burn. Christmas had come again to the little ranch in Colorado, and this time there was no shadow of guilt darkening the joy, no weight of secrets pressing down on celebration, just peace, just gratitude, just two people and the life they had built together on a foundation of truth and grace. The candle flame glowed through the snowfall, steady and bright and warm, a light in the darkness, a sign of hope, a symbol of a soul redeemed at Christmas.